Chapter 539, Competition in the Auction, Part 1, The Great Gas City is worthy of being one of the centers of River Shore Star Field. After all, the successor of one of its forces has such a cultivation level. Yi Xuan secretly became speechless. Don't tell me these forces have the backing of a great sage expert keeping watch? Yi Xuan knew that it was easy to find sage experts in these star regions because of the harsh living environment. However, it was very difficult to find great sage experts. Generally, only one or two great sage experts could be found in a star region. But, it couldn't be compared with the huge number of great sage experts in those other worlds. This place also couldn't be compared with a colossus like the True Martial University. Generally, the successors of True Martial University used to be at least at the Sage Great Perfection level. So, there was no comparison whatsoever. Therefore, this force was enough to run rampant in this star region if a senior great sage expert was keeping watch. Yi Xuan was also somewhat worried. That great gas building was still in the center of the great gas collar. So, everyone's gaze was fixated on the great gas building. After all, it was the main target of the experts who had rushed over here. In fact, the treasures of great gas collar were like the appetizer before the main course. The experts which were the real deal had arrived here for the heritages present inside the great gas building, and the magical items that could appear inside. However, the great gas collar wasn't worth their time. Of course, the target of the majority of experts on the weaker side was merely the heavenly treasures that appeared inside the great gas collar, since they couldn't dare to think about obtaining the heritages inside the great gas building. It wasn't clear how many experts had arrived. However, only 10 experts could get the permission to enter the great gas building. Obviously, the competition was intense and brutal. So, none of the experts who were below the Sage Great Perfection realm had ever gotten the permission in the past. Therefore, entering the building was merely a delusional and unrealistic thought for the majority of the people. Yi Xiwen's current strength was enough to defend himself inside the great gas collar. However, it wasn't enough if he wanted to get the permission to enter. Yi Xuan decided that he would undergo closed-door training once the auction was over so that he could get the permission to enter. The entire great gas collar would vibrate 3 times more. There was half year left before the great gas collar finished spitting magical items. And, he would have made the breakthrough into the late stage of Sage Realm by then. Therefore, there would be hope of getting the permission to enter the great gas building, and obtaining the heritages. Another group of experts had arrived after the arrival of the young master Tian Jian of the Sky Moon Sword School. However, they weren't holding swords like the experts of the Sky Moon Sword School. Instead, each of these experts was holding different kinds of weapons. They were headed by a tall man whose face carried a savage look, and whose eyes looked ice-cold and ruthless. Moreover, his cultivation was as good as that of young master Tian Jian. He is King Tai of the Heaven-Dominating Dojo. His aura is very ferocious. He looks like a savage beast. He had merely shot a glance this way, and everyone had still felt as if they were falling down an ice hole. He is extremely frightening. Don't you know that King Tai had fallen into a lair of star beasts in his childhood? He was rescued several years later. However, he had transformed into a beast by then. His bearing is like a savage's. He kills the entire family of anyone who goes against him. He is the chief disciple of Dominating Heaven's dojo. The man's tone dropped increasingly. It seemed as if he was afraid that King Tai might hear him. The private room had been designed very cleverly since no one could see inside the room from outside. However, one could use their divine sense from inside the room in order to see what was happening outside. Yi Xuan felt the ferocious aura of King Tai. He had made everyone scared, and nobody had dared to approach him. After all, he looked like a fierce beast. In fact, one would have believed that a fierce beast stood in front of them and not a man if they had closed their eyes and didn't see him. Some other experts had also arrived after the people of these two groups. However, they hadn't been able to cause a sensation like the people of these two groups had. Yi Xuan fed the spirit fruits to Xiaoya. He hadn't given her any medicinal pill since he was afraid that it would ruin her foundation. Her foundation was very deep and very pure at the same time. These medicinal pills would ruin her unique innate talent if she used them for increasing her cultivation speed. However, these spirit fruits wouldn't harm her. These fruits were natural, and had been grown on the ground. So, nothing could be better than these fruits. Moreover, Yi Xuan felt that Xiaoya wasn't far from making the breakthrough into the truth realm. In fact, she would undoubtedly make the breakthrough into the truth realm within 10 years. However, he couldn't ponder much on this since the auction began very soon. It began with the loud thump sound of a wooden mallet. It seemed that the sharp and clear sound worked as a calming force, and suddenly made the noisy atmosphere tranquil. The great gas chamber of commerce was rich and overbearing. Even that wooden mallet was a divine tool. In fact, it was a sage tool that could transform into a weapon at the time of need. Everyone looked toward the middle of the auction stage at this moment. They saw an approximately 20-year-old young woman. She was dressed up in a dark green muslin skirt. Her facial features looked delicate, and her skin was as fair as snow. Her jade-like delicate arms were partly visible under her muslin skirt. They looked like lotuses, and made her look even more attractive. A lot of people whistled like boiling pots when they saw this woman on stage. We are very lucky this time. Great Gas Chamber of Commerce's genius Wen Yiren is hosting the auction. Yeah, I've heard that Wen Yiren is a genius in the field of business. Great Gas Chamber of Commerce used to be one of the many chambers of commerce in the Great Gas Collar in the past. However, it dominates the other chambers of commerce in the Great Gas City now, and it's all due to her great efforts. In fact, it has become a colossal force like the dominating Heaven Dojo and the Sky Moon Sword School within a short span of 300 years. She's not just a business genius. After all, those other businessmen are nothing but money makers. They just know give and take. However, she's also a top cultivator. In fact, it is said that her cultivation is as good as that of King Tai and young Master Tian Jian. She is counted among Great Gas 4 heroes, and has many admirers. Yi Xuan heard these people's discussion, and understood that this young woman was one of the 4 heroes of Great Gas. He hadn't spent much time in Great Gas City. However, he had heard about the so-called Great Gas 4 heroes. All 4 of these individuals were outstanding. The eldest young master of the city government was the other hero apart from King Tai, young Master Tian Jian, and Wen Yiren. He was also ranked first among the 4 heroes of Great Gas. This eldest young master of the city government wasn't the most popular among the 4 heroes even though everyone considered him as the leader of the 4 heroes. He wasn't as popular as Wen Yiren. After all, she looked beautiful, her cultivation was on top. Moreover, she had the support of a colossus like the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce behind her. One would soar into the sky if they got married to her. They would make rapid career advancement. However, she was even more difficult to get than the most precious treasures. One could offend anyone in the city, except Wen Yiren. Everyone, I'm extremely grateful to have you all here. I hope everyone can buy whatever they think is important in the following auction. Wen Yiren didn't speak much. However, her charming face made everyone feel as if they had bathed in a spring breeze, and every bit of resentment had been dispelled from their hearts. Now, we're going to auction today's first item. It's a sage-level inner armor. This sage-level inner armor is a bit damaged. However, its defensive power is far greater than that of those pseudo-sage tools. So, one would have much more assurance when they would go for the treasure hunt in Great Gas Collar if they had this inner armor. Wen Yiren calmly said. The starting bid for this sage-level inner armor is 70 million primary spirit dawn. This inner armor made all the experts who were sitting below go crazy. After all, many among them wanted to go to the Great Gas Collar. There were semi-sage and sage experts among them. However, it didn't matter what kind of strength they possessed or what their cultivation was. Everyone knew what kind of place the Great Gas Collar was. It was considered as an extremely dangerous place. After all, one could lose their life on the spot if they weren't cautious enough. Therefore, one must increase their strength as much as possible before venturing there. The divine tools were mere accessories. However, they could be regarded as a part of one's strength. Many among these people were still using pseudo-sage tools since the sage tools were rare. And, this was a very rare kind of divine tool. It was certainly a bit damaged. However, countless people would still chase after it like ducks. Two young girls who were clad in revealing attires came up on stage with a metallic tray. These two young girls would have certainly attracted the attention of a lot of people earlier. However, no one paid any attention to them at this time. Everyone's gaze was fixed on the tray that had been covered by a red cloth. That cloth was also a divine tool which had cut off other people's divine senses. Therefore, they couldn't use their divine senses in order to see what was inside it. A snow-white inner armor appeared in front of everyone as when Iren lifted the red cloth. This inner armor was faintly emitting sage power. It had unleashed a unique coercion that could be classified as the embodiment of anger. However, one corner of the inner armor was broken. There was a huge hole at that place. It seemed as if it had been drilled with a sharp weapon. This great gas chamber of commerce has brought out a sage tool in the beginning of the auction. Naturally, there is no need to say that they are rich and overbearing. It's well known that many sage experts don't have sage tools, and even some great sage experts use pseudo-sage tools. So, it is clear that there is a shortage of sage tools these days. This sage tool is damaged. However, the price of a rare divine tool like this inner armor can't be any less. In fact, it can't be under the price of general sage tools. Yi Shiwen secretly thought. Then, he swept out his divine sense, and found out that this snow-white inner armor had been made of the skin of a snake-type demon beast. However, he couldn't find out which demon beast it was. This type of inner armor would have attracted his attention in the past. However, his gilded tyrant form itself was the best defense. So, this inner armor would be useless if even his tyrant body wasn't able to resist an attack. Moreover, this inner armor would be even more useless if his tyrant body was able to resist the attack. Therefore, he had always been dismissive about such defense-type divine tools. In fact, it would be better to buy some attack-type tools instead. However, he looked at Xiaoye who was beside him. She was much more fragile than him since she was merely an expert of the Xiantian realm. And, even a slight negligence on his part could cause a huge disaster. So, he opened his mouth and shouted, 75 million. Chapter 540. 100 million, a loud shout suddenly overshadowed Yi Ziwen's voice. Yi Shiwen carefully listened. Isn't this dominating Heaven Dojo's King Tai? Who's spending such a huge amount? Someone asked with unsurely. Who else can it be other than King Tai? Gee. He is willing to spend this much for Wen Yiren. What do you mean? Many people's ears erected suddenly. They had become curious. You guys are outsiders. Maybe that's why you don't know about this matter. However, who in our great gas city doesn't know that King Tai has been courting Wen Yiren for 10 years now? Moreover, his infatuation with Wen Yiren hasn't decreased one bit. He targets the first and last auction items whenever Wen Yiren hosts the auction. He must take them. And, it's a dead end for anyone who dares to challenge him. Yi Shiwen pondered secretly. It's no wonder that everyone is standing still, and that they haven't shouted the price for a long time. Initially, he had believed that everyone must be considering chances of profit and loss. After all, it wasn't a good deal to purchase a damaged sage-level inner armor for 70 million primary spirit dawn. However, it had also occurred to him that different people should have had different views. A sage tool would cost approximately 100 million primary spirit dawn. In fact, a good quality sage tool might even get sold for 200 to 300 million primary spirit dawn. However, it would get sold for that much only, and not more than that. So, a sage-level inner armor would cost approximately 200 million. This inner armor's starting bid was 70 million. However, it could clearly be seen that it was seriously damaged. So, some discount must be given on its price. In fact, it would be better to purchase a new one than having to repair it. Moreover, it must also be considered whether one has an urgent requirement of this divine tool or not. You're buying this inner armor for the girl? Yi Mo's voice reverberated inside Yi Zaiwen's mind. Yes. Yi Shiwen nodded. I don't need it since I have Tyrant Body. Tyrant Body is stronger than anything else. However, she is not that strong. So, she might have to suffer disastrous consequences if she's not prepared for the upcoming battles. But, it's broken. Are you planning to buy some materials to patch it as well? Yi Mo asked. Yi Shiwen nodded. His level of refining tools wasn't even close to that of those real great masters who used to refine tools. However, his skill couldn't be compared with an average person either. So, mending an inner armor wasn't an issue for him. Yes. I'll buy some materials in the auction. Yi Shiwen replied. He possessed a large number of heavenly treasures. However, most of them were raw materials for alchemy. So, he had very few materials for refining tools. Gentlemen and friends, let me have this inner armor. I want it. King Tai's voice was loud and clear like the sound of a big bell. However, his polite words had a strong hint of pressure. In fact, the threatening intention was very profound. 105 million. Yi Shiwen shouted softly. His voice sounded very clear in this quiet auction site. Everyone was left dumbstruck by this. Who is this audacious person? He has dared to compete against a person like King Tai. Does he have a death wish? King Tai frowned inside his private room. He hadn't met such a daring person for a long time. After all, everyone respected him since he enjoyed a very high status. So, it didn't even matter what his strength was. Who would dare to ignore the chief disciple of the dominating Heaven Dojo? 110 million. King Tai shouted once again. This amount was more than enough for a damaged inner armor. So, he became a bit distressed, and an ominous light flickered in his eyes. King Tai didn't know who this stranger was. So, he couldn't even look down on him. However, this price had made him somewhat distressed. A sage tool would approximately cost 100 million primary spirit dawn. And, there were many sage experts who had never possessed a sage tool. So, one could imagine what the real worth of these 100 million primary spirit dawn was. In fact, there had been many sage experts who hadn't been able to gather this much money in their entire lifetime. It hadn't been very easy to gather so much wealth even for King Tai. And, he wouldn't have spent such a huge amount of money, and suffered such a heavy loss if he didn't want to impress Wen Yiren. 110 million, won. Wen Yiren revealed a pleasant smile on her face. It was a good thing for the Chamber of Commerce that people were competing to buy this commodity. She had been afraid that nobody would compete for it. She knew that King Tai came every time she hosted the auction in order to impress her. However, she wanted someone to dare and compete against him. 110 million, too. 115 million. Yi Shiwen suddenly shouted from his private room when everyone had been thinking that he had given up. Oh! Suddenly, everyone went into an uproar. Yi Zaiwen's act had been unconscious in the beginning. However, what about now? It had to be intentional this time. It was evident that he didn't give importance to King Tai. Who is this man? Do you know this man? He's very bold. He isn't giving face to King Tai, someone said in disbelief. Does he have a death wish? King Tai has an ominous reputation. He can kill anyone who dares to disobey him. This man is safe inside the territory of Great Gas Chamber of Commerce right now. However, it will be very difficult for this man to get out of Great Gas City alive. He is very courageous. However, unfortunately he isn't far from his death. No one was optimistic about Yi Shiwen. They didn't think that he could escape from King Tai's hands. Yishuan was following the path of his doom in their opinion. 130 million. King Tai exclaimed in a loud voice. The speed of response was very quick. He didn't fall below Yishuan. Go and find which man is daring to snatch my stuff. He is courting death. King Tai ordered one of his aides. His complexion had turned fierce. I won't let him live. I'll kill him, and then use his heart and liver to prepare a meal. An ordinary person would have gotten scared to death if they had heard King Tai's vicious words. However, the countenances of the experts by his side didn't change. It was clear that they had seen King Tai's barbaric attitude many times in the past. Yes, young lord. A weak-looking expert answered. He then opened the door, and went out. Yishuan didn't know what was happening in King Tai's private room. However, he wouldn't have cared even if he had known. He didn't need to worry. After all, he could escape even if a great sage expert confronted him. And, he could kill anyone as long as they weren't a great sage expert. Of course, he could do so only with the aid of the blood slave since it controlled a star colossus, 135 million. Yishuan shouted. His voice seemed direct and effective. It didn't show any signs of weakness either. However, he had become worried since his limit was 150 million. He wouldn't be able to continue if the bid surpassed this amount. After all, he wanted to get a good deal out of this auction. Otherwise, it would be better to go and buy a new inner armor instead of spending this much money on a damaged one. King Tai wanted to impress Wen Yiren. However, Yishuan neither had such a desire nor was he a foolish spendthrift. Moreover, primary spirit dawn had flown out of his hand like running water because of his mysterious space. Many sage experts might not have earned the amount of money that he had already spent. However, he didn't have any regrets about doing so since it was something he should have spent his money on. He had spent his money on himself. But, that didn't mean that he was a spendthrift. Good, very good. King Tai smirked. He smiled through his anger. He had been famous for many years. And, nobody had ever dared to disregard him like this. A look which was as fierce as a beast's appeared in his eyes when he smiled. He's very bold. However, I can't let him walk away from this city alive. King Tai smiled instead of being angry. I will let him have it if he wants it so badly. However, I've sent someone to keep watch. So, I'm not giving up yet. I want everyone to see the end of this person who has dared to disobey me. King Tai hadn't become hostile and killed Yishuan on the spot because it was Wen Yiren's territory. However, this didn't mean that he would let go of a guy who had dared to go against him. King Tai didn't continue to compete with Yishuan, and this was against everyone's expectations. After all, he had given up on the face of it. However, those who were familiar with King Tai's nature knew that he would take his revenge after the auction. King Tai isn't speaking up. Are the legends about him false? They're not false. That boy is done for. He shouldn't have dared to compete with King Tai in this manner. After all, King Tai is always ready when it comes to killing people and robbing their possessions. Someone who was very familiar with King Tai smiled disdainfully and said. Many people had found this whole incident of someone opposing King Tai very entertaining. However, that was only until the end of the auction. This incident would stop mattering rather quickly for everyone else apart from Yishuan. Many other items appeared one by one after Yishuan had obtained the inner armor. Medicinal pills, divine tools, demon beasts' inner cores, and even demon beasts' eggs were sold in the auction. Basically, there were all kinds of extraordinary things. These things could rarely be seen on ordinary days. One could buy these things outside of this auction, but they would face great difficulty in doing so. Moreover, some of these things could only be purchased in such auctions. Those things streamed out like running water, and were quickly sold. There were also various types of materials for refining tools. The auction finally came to an end after it had continued for an entire day. Yishuan had also purchased many rare and precious raw materials, spirit fruits, and so on in this auction. He had spent over 50 million primary spirit dawn on these things. It could be said that he had also made a good harvest. The next and last item of this auction is 9-leaf dragon primary grass. This grass can heal the injuries sustained by the soul, and raise it to higher level. It is a top-grade medicinal herb. And its base price is 100 million. When Eren explained, everyone held their breath. A mere medicinal herb was getting sold at the price of a sage tool. Moreover, this was only its base price. It wasn't clear what price it would be sold at if its price continued to increase during the auction. A person's soul sustained injuries in a fight only on rare occasions. However, it would be troublesome if that were to happen. The wounds on the body could be cured quite easily. After all, there were thousands of treatments for it. However, the ordinary methods couldn't be used for curing injuries sustained by the soul. The treatment scope of Yi Zaiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique would extend from curing just physical injuries to curing soul injuries once had advanced a step further. However, there was no way to cure soul injuries as per Yi Zaiwen's current level of Phoenix regeneration technique. Otherwise, he would have already treated Yi Mo, who had exhausted the primary essence of his own soul, and had fallen into a deep sleep slumber. However, a medicinal herb had appeared that could heal souls. A bright light flashed in Yi Zaiwen's eyes. I must obtain it irrespective of the price that I must pay. Chapter 541. Yi Mo had recovered more than halfway till now. However, he hadn't recovered completely. But, he would recover very quickly if he got this 9-leaf dragon primary grass. And, Yi Shiwen would get a strong assistance when that would happen. The ordinary experts who sat downstairs were whispering. However, not many of them could dare to open their mouths to place a bid. After all, the base price of this commodity was 100 million. So, they couldn't participate in this auction since they didn't have a lot of primary spirit dawn. In fact, a lot of experts couldn't collect this much wealth in their entire lifetime. Moreover, it would have been worthwhile to spend this much money if it were a sage tool. However, spending such a huge amount of money for 9-leaf dragon primary grass wasn't such a good idea since it wasn't even certain whether it would ever come to use. Those ordinary experts looked toward those private rooms located on the second floor. Only those rich people who occupied those private rooms could afford this kind of price right now. 150 million, the first one to make a bid was King Tai. This was obviously expected. Everyone believed that he would snatch away the first and last commodities as long as when Eren hosted an auction. After all, he had the support of a colossus like dominating Heaven Dojo behind him. An ordinary person couldn't quote such a large price. However, when Eren never hosted an ordinary auction. So, King Tai didn't get many such opportunities. Many people held their breaths as they heard this bid. King Tai was the chief disciple of the dominating Heaven Dojo. So, he didn't care about wasting primary spirit dawn. He had increased the price by 50% in one fell swoop. I want this 9-leafed dragon primary grass. King Tai stated. His voice sounded ice-cold and a bit hoarse. It seemed as if a beast was proclaiming dominance in its territory. Moreover, there was a strong sense of threat in his tone. 200 million. Pardon me, but I also want to have some fun. I want this 9-leaf dragon primary grass, a chilly voice came from a private room at this time. Isn't this Sky Moon Sword School's young master Tianjian? Why does he want to take part in this game? Does he want to compete with King Tai? Somebody soon found out that this voice belonged to young master Tianjian. Young Master Tianjian was one of the 4 heroes of the Great Gas City. Many people became excited as a result. They had enjoyed watching Yi Shiwen and King Tai competing with each other a while back. But, young Master Tianjian's bid had made them even more excited. A contest that involved 2 of the 4 heroes would always attract people's attention the most, and would become a hot topic for discussion. After all, these 4 heroes were the future leaders of the 4 forces of the Great Gas City. 210 million. King Tai clenched his teeth and said. 200 million primary spirit dawn had already surpassed the genuine price of the 9-leaf dragon primary grass. Moreover, King Tai couldn't spend money so extravagantly even if he was the chief disciple of the dominating heaven dojo. An ominous light flickered in his eyes, and he secretly became furious. The first item had been taken by someone else. And now, he had to compete for the last one too. 220 million. Young Master Tianjian shouted. Both of them had clearly become careful after the price had increased to 200 million. So, they weren't raising the bid by a large amount anymore. Bastard! King Tai had become very angry. The young Master Tianjian wanted to oppose him today. When Yi Ren was the only woman among the 4 heroes of the Great Gas City. And, she didn't have any conflict with the others. The city government's eldest young master remained aloof from the other 3 heroes. So, only these 2 men had a conflict with each other among the 4 heroes. They would obstruct each other's path whenever they got the opportunity. King Tai hadn't made his bid when a loud and clear voice sounded, 250 million. King Tai instantly recognized this voice. Isn't this the same guy who competed for the first item with me? Yi Xuan had placed several bids so far, but he had been very low-key. So, King Tai had almost forgotten about Yi Xuan after young Master Tianjian's bid. He had also forgotten about teaching Yi Xuan a lesson. However, Yi Xuan had dared to challenge him again now. Therefore, King Tai believed that Yi Xuan was courting death this time. Everyone was left dumbstruck. Someone had dared to interfere in these 2 men's contest. They too had obviously recognized this voice. Isn't this the same guy who had competed for the first item? Everyone had become excited, and it seemed as if a boiler had suddenly exploded. Moreover, the price had increased to 250 million. So, it was clear that this mysterious person was as wealthy as the other 2 contenders. Yi Xuan had spent more than 200 million already. And, he had quoted 250 million this time. So, he had at least 450 to 500 million primary spirit dawn. Some people gasped after they made this calculation. Only the top experts of Sage Realm, or the ones who had entered the Great Sage Realm, could possess a wealth of 450 million. In fact, this figure was enough to be the net worth of a Great Sage expert. Young Master Tianjian's and King Tai's confidence had stemmed from the forces that backed them. They had spent millions once or twice because of this backing. But, what was the background of this man? Could he also be a disciple of some superforce? This was also a possibility. The Great Gas Collar was about to open. So, experts from all parts of the River Shore Star Field had arrived here. Some experts of neighboring star regions had also arrived. So, it couldn't be considered strange if a disciple of some superforce had also arrived. In fact, everything would make sense if it was so. Of course, they didn't know that Yi Xuan was alone. Otherwise, they would have gotten scared to death. There were never enough primary spirit dawn for Yi Xuan. He would soon use up whatever he had earned. The mysterious space was like a mega beast. It would soon swallow his entire wealth like a bottomless pit. However, he couldn't separate it from himself. True Martial University had much more resources as compared to these forces of the Great Gas City. However, Yi Zaiwen's current status in the True Martial University wasn't on the same level as that of these people in their respective forces. Naturally, he couldn't freely spend the entire force's resources like them. That's intriguing. Young Master Tianjian slightly raised the corner of his mouth inside his private room. He had begun to take some interest in this man who had interfered in his contest with King Tai. After all, such a man could either be a big idiot, or have some serious backing. He preferred to believe the latter. After all, how could an idiot possess so much wealth? Such a person would have already been robbed by someone in this world full of powerful people. 260 million. King Tai quoted his renewed price. However, everyone could tell that he was extreme enraged. Blood dripped in his heart. 260 million primary spirit dawn was an astronomical figure. However, he had no choice but to quote this price since he didn't wish to lose face in front of Wen Yiren. 300 million. Yi Shiwen stated without batting an eye. This 9-leaf dragon primary grass was extremely important for Yi Mo's recovery. So, he had to get it even if he had to spend the entire amount of primary spirit dawn that he had in his stock. Yi Shiwen had given many sage tools to Yi Mo to swallow. The total cost of those sage tools surpassed 2 billion primary spirit dawn. So, he obviously wouldn't regret spending a few million more. It could be said that he was always short of money. So, he had always faced the shortage of primary spirit dawn during his cultivation. However, it must also be said that he was rich when there was a need to be. He could spend as much money as was required if he considered the cause to be important. Yi Zaiwen's bid blew everyone away. This person had to be a rich lord. The other bidders were also considered rich. But, they were increasing the price by 10 million at a time. However, this man was increasing the price by 50 million at a time. It seemed that this person had recently acquired a lot of wealth, and that money wasn't money for him. It seemed as if it was merely a pile of papers. Even when Yiren was astonished by Yi Zaiwen's bid. She had been hosting auctions for many years now. So, it wasn't that she hadn't seen a lot of rich men. However, she had seen such an extremely extravagant rich man for the first time. Everyone wants it so desperately. So, I must behave like a gentleman, and I mustn't snatch what they want. I withdraw. Young Master Tianjian spoke up in a nonchalant manner. Damn it. This guy was only messing with me. King Tai was secretly tensed. Young Master Tianjian was only messing with him. After all, he knew that King Tai wouldn't want to lose face in front of Wen Yiren. Therefore, he had forced him to bleed a huge amount of money. 310 million. King Tai almost roared this time. Bastard, bastard. I must kill him. He has forced me to spend so much money. The sound of King Tai's roar reverberated inside his private room. Many of his subordinates hid far from him. They didn't dare to come near him. It would certainly be disastrous if his wrath fell upon them. A feeling of intense hate for Yi Shiwen and young Master Tianjian had surged inside King Tai's heart at this time. 350 million. Yi Shiwen spoke up. However, his voice was calm. There was no hint of hesitation in it, as if this price was practically nothing for him. He could have spent his entire wealth for Yi Mo's recovery. However, he didn't want to behave like a local tyrant. This King Tai wanted to buy this last item of the auction at all cost because he wanted to act as a very wealthy person in front of Wen Yiren. Perhaps, he would have trailed after Yi Zaiwen's bids unceasingly if Yi Shiwen had increased the bid by 10 million at a time. And then, Yi Shiwen might have had to pay a lot more. Therefore, Yi Shiwen believed that he could force King Tai to quit only by acting as a rich person. In fact, King Tai would have continued to compete if Yi Shiwen had acted timidly. King Tai's complexion had turned a deep shade of red. Bastard, I will crush you along with your wealth. King Tai used to crush his competitors using his wealth. However, he himself had been made speechless by someone who had used the power of money. This had happened to him for the first time in his life. King Tai didn't have any choice but to quit since he only had 300 million primary spirit dawn, and that too after adding the primary spirit dawn of the dominating heaven dojo. In fact, he wouldn't have been able to increase the bids so crazily without the dominating heaven dojo's backing. He had been distressed at first because the price of the last item had become too high. Therefore, he would have had to spend a large amount of primary spirit dawn to buy the item. However, he had become even more distressed now. And, that was because he couldn't increase the price anymore. So, he felt that he had lost face in front of Wen Yiren. And, he hated Yi Shiwen even more because of this. Yi Shiwen had stunned everyone. A lot of people had started to speculate about his identity. Where has this local tyrant arrived from? He is so wealthy that he is throwing away money recklessly. They wouldn't have been left dumbstruck if Yi Shiwen had increased the price by 10 million at a time. However, he had increased the bid by a large amount every time. This had blown everyone away. King Tai didn't raise the bid any further, and this last item smoothly fell into Yi Zaiwen's lap. The auction had finally come to an end. However, numerous experts were still excited. After all, they had thought that King Tai or young Master Tian Jian would play the leading role in this auction. However, they hadn't expected that someone would appear in the middle of their contest, and would snatch away the limelight. Yi Shiwen quietly went backstage along with Xiaoye while everyone was still discussing spiritedly. After all, he wanted to receive the things that he had bought in the auction. Chapter 542. Yi Shiwen arrived at the backside of the room. He was surprised to see the silhouette of a familiar person. That person was none other than Yan Yunting. She was chatting non-stop with Wen Yiren. Sister Wen, I have arrived in order to ask you whether you have any information about the green-scaled fruit. Yan Yunting asked. We have already been paying attention to this matter. We will surely hand over the green-scaled fruit to you once we find it. Wen Yiren replied. Yi Shiwen saw both of them talking and laughing. It seemed that they were very familiar with each other. However, he hadn't expected that. After all, Wen Yiren and Yan Yunting didn't share the same social status. Young Master Yi. Yan Yunting became happy the moment she saw that Yi Shiwen there as well. And, she became even more excited when she saw that Xiaoye had also come. Xiaoye didn't appear to be intimately acquainted with her. But, that hadn't hindered her fondness for Xiaoye. In fact, she became excited every time she looked at Xiaoye. I didn't expect to see you here. Yi Shiwen was very surprised. However, he was even more surprised to see the relationship between Yan Yunting and Wen Yiren. How has Villa Lord Yan allowed you come alone? Yi Shiwen asked. He hadn't expected that Yan Hongyi would send his daughter instead of coming by himself. My daddy hasn't recovered from his injuries yet. Even my mother is unwell. So, it's just me in the end. Yan Yunting let out a chuckle. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in front of Yi Shiwen, and he raised his head to see who it was. It was Wen Yiren. So, you are that young Master Yi Yan Yunting had mentioned about. Wen Yiren lightly stepped forward. Then, she let out a smile and said. Yi Shiwen shot a glance at Yan Yunting. He didn't know what capacity he had been introduced to Wen Yiren in. Yes. It's nice to meet you, Lady Wen. Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and replied. Young Master Yi is outstanding. Even King Tai suffered a loss at your hands. Wen Yiren slightly smiled and said. She possessed a peculiar charm. It wasn't my intention to compete with him. I needed those things. Yi Shiwen lightly replied. King Tai believed that Yi Shiwen had made him lose face. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care about that since he hadn't opposed King Tai on purpose. Wen Yiren's wonderful pair of eyes scanned Yi Zaiwen's body. Then, she chuckled and said, King Tai isn't a nice person. He may come after you. You can seek help from our Chamber of Commerce in case you need it. After all, this matter has started in our Chamber of Commerce. Wen Yiren said. She knew how King Tai's attitude was. So, she warned Yi Shiwen, as well as offered her assistance in the matter. Yi Shiwen was somewhat surprised by this. King Tai had an infatuation for Wen Yiren. However, Wen Yiren didn't seem to have a very good opinion of him. There will be no need for that. I only wish to take away the items that I've bought. However, I would like to borrow a place in your Chamber of Commerce for closed-door training. Yi Shiwen said. He had decided that he would carry out closed-door training to make the breakthrough into the late stage of Sage Realm once the auction had ended. It's not a problem. I will ask someone to make arrangements for you. Wen Yiren nodded. This matter was nothing for her. Yi Shiwen had spent millions of primary spirit dawn in their Chamber of Commerce. So, this matter was nothing compared to what he had done. However, she was still looking at him. She had maintained a smiling expression at the corner of her mouth this whole time. He has spent so much. Undoubtedly, he must be thinking of having a bit of protection from the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. He's not an idiot. He must know that he has offended King Tai very much. Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid of King Tai. However, he needed time until he had made the breakthrough into the late stage of Sage Realm. He wouldn't have to be afraid of King Tai at that time even if he didn't use the Star Colossus. Boy, I've finally found you. Now, you must accept your death like an obedient kid. A coarse and wild roar came from not far away. A group of people arrived from around the corner. They were headed by King Tai. Yi Shiwen saw King Tai's tall figure. His coarse and wild aura resembled that of a beast. His pair of red eyes was glaring at Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen suddenly felt that a dangerous divine sense had locked upon him. It was like a warning sign before a beast throws itself towards its prey. It's such a wonderful coincidence that Lady Wen is also present here. King Tai's gaze fell on Wen Yiren, who was beside Yi Shiwen. So, he restrained his murderous aura, and a smile appeared on his face. But, it seemed as if a beast was smiling. It looked bizarre. I don't know why young Master King has arrived here. Have you arrived here to collect the items that you've bought in the auction? Don't worry. Our people will deliver it at the Dominating Heaven Dojo. Wen Yiren let out an engaging smile as she spoke to this well-known old friend of hers. A fierce look appeared on King Tai's face as he heard this. He then said, Wen Yiren, I think you know of my temperament and habit. No one can save the person whom I wish to kill. This boy is going to die. Wen Yiren knew this very well. However, she couldn't let King Tai prevail. After all, the reputation of their Great Gas Chamber of Commerce would get ruined if a person had to face retaliation for having purchased some things from their auction. In fact, no one would dare to buy anything from their Chamber of Commerce if such news spread in the city. I'm sorry. But, this is our Chamber of Commerce. I'm sure that you're familiar with the rules of our Chamber of Commerce. No one can touch our guests inside our territory. The smile vanished from Wen Yiren's face as she coldly replied. King Tai's complexion turned ashen. He hadn't expected that Wen Yiren would come out in Yi Ziwen's protection. He started to burn with rage because of this. Was their 100-years-old friendship inferior to this boy who had come from God knows where? He took a few steps while looking at Yi Shiwen. However, he was surprised to see that Yi Shiwen merely stood at his place with a seemingly unaffected attitude. In fact, he didn't give King Tai any attention whatsoever. He had only created a ring of real elemental energy around Xiaoya for her protection. And, he had isolated her from King Tai's gaze in this way. A gaze could also kill a person. This wasn't a fable for the real powerhouses. Good, very good. You are merely an insignificant expert of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. And, you have still dared to oppose me. So, you're very ambitious, and have the courage of a leopard. However, your days are numbered. Hide if you want to hide. But, you won't be able to do so for long. You'll be safe only if you never step out of the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. Otherwise, you'll die. King Tai's complexion had turned dark. King Tai's beastly aura surged overwhelmingly as it rolled towards Yi Shiwen. It was enough to crush the imposing aura of an average sage expert of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. However, Yi Shiwen stood calmly, as if King Tai's beastly aura hadn't affected him. King Tai had to restrain his aura in the end. After all, Wen Yiren was present there, and this place was the territory of Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. So, he must not act presumptuously. However, he shot a firm glance at Yi Shiwen. Then, he turned around and left. This uncle is so ferocious. Xiaoya grabbed the corner of the lower hem of Yi Ziwen's jacket, and said. He looks like a mad dog fighting for food on the street. Xiaoya had said these words very innocently. After all, children's words carry no harm. However, Yi Shiwen started to laugh loudly. King Tai hadn't gone far when he abruptly came to a stop. However, he didn't take a step further for a while. Mad dog fighting for food on the street. King Tai's dark face burst with rage as he walked away from the great gas chamber of commerce along with the dominating heaven dojos. However, he had vowed that he would kill this boy of unknown origin in a brutal manner. Ha 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 ha. Yi Xuan laughed wildly while holding his stomach. Xiao Ya's single sentence had made the impact of 1,000 sentences. Xiao Ya had spoken innocently. However, it was the most appropriate remark one could have made. Young Master Yi, I wanted to mediate between you and him. However, it seems that I've failed. King Tai won't forget this matter very easily. When Yi Ren said. She looked a bit worried. I will crush him to death if he dares to cause trouble. Yi Xuan replied indifferently. It seemed as if he was talking about a flea that he would crush to death. A look of surprise appeared on Wen Yi Ren's face when she heard this. I'll crush him to death if he dares to cause trouble. Who would dare to speak such words about an extremely powerful person like King Tai? He has dared to say such a thing even though he knows about King Tai's status and power. And, he doesn't seem to be foolish either. So, he must have some solid backing. She didn't believe that Yi Xuan was a stupid person. That meant that he certainly had some strong backing. What is his background? Wen Yi Ren was also slightly amazed. However, she didn't say much since it looked like Yi Xuan had planned everything in advance. Anyway, he was not in danger as long as he was in the Chamber of Commerce. Yi Xuan soon completed all the formalities. And, he got the things that he had bought after he handed over the primary spirit Dawn. Yi Mo, you should recover quickly with this 9-leaf dragon primary grass. Yi Zaiwen's heart had been unburdened greatly after he had finally obtained the 9-leaf dragon primary grass. It was the most precious item for him among all the things that he had bought. He would have a powerful assistance once Yi Mo had recovered. So, he would have much more assurance if he left for the Great Gas Collar after that. He hadn't spent 400 million in a blind frenzy. The amount of money which ordinary sage experts couldn't earn in their entire lifetimes had been spent by him without thinking too much. So, he had probably come across as a spendthrift who wanted to become a local tyrant. And, when Yi Ren had perhaps come out for his protection because of this reason. Ha, I can finally get rid of this half-dead and half-alive state. Yi Mo laughed and said. However, you must be careful. King Tai isn't the friendly kind. He must be scheming against you, and can attack you anytime and anywhere. I know. However, my strength will increase significantly after I've made the breakthrough into the late stage of Sage Realm. At that time, they'll be able to urge the Heavenly Source Mirror to thoroughly transform the soul of Star Colossus into the Blood Slave. Then, the Star Colossus body will exhibit even more might. Sooner or later, it will make the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm as well. And, I will be able to travel anywhere in this big world when that happens. Yi Xuan said. He was certainly aware of King Tai's threat. However, he would follow his own plan for now. Then, I will crush King Tai to death if he dares to cause trouble. Yi Xuan stated in a cold voice. When Yi Ren didn't make Yi Xuan wait for a long time. Soon, she had a secret chamber tidied up for Yi Zaiwen's closed-door training. This hadn't been a difficult thing for her due to the influence of Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. Yi Xuan placed Xiao Ya inside the Heavenly Source Mirror in order to prepare against contingencies. Then, he laid out layers of barrier formations inside the secret chamber. This would buy him enough time to wake up in case something happened. This represented the so-called saying don't do harm to others, but don't allow others to do harm to you either. After all, he hadn't been familiar with the Chamber of Commerce to a great extent. Yi Xuan sat down on a mat, and began the closed-door training after he had made all the preparations. Chapter 543. Yi Xuan sat cross-legged on the mat. The enlightening mind ancient tree had fully flexed itself. And, the divine rays that hung down from the tree had completely shrouded him. So many years had passed, but the enlightening mind ancient tree had grown barely a few inches. It was hard to say how much time it would take for it to grow to the level mentioned in the fables. Yi Zaiwen's chaotic and distracting thoughts had gotten suppressed since he was shrouded by the divine rays of the enlightening mind ancient tree. So, his mind had become clear and calm now. The observing person scripture had begun to operate crazily within his body. The star power had started to boil inside his universe. His universe looked like an ocean full of stars at the moment. The real elemental energy flowed through his entire body. It could be said that Yi Zaiwen's foundation was extremely profound. Many of the experts who had been cultivating for several hundred years did not have a foundation as profound as his. He might not have been able to break the norms and challenge experts that were several stages higher than him if his foundation hadn't been so profound. Therefore, he wasn't worried at present. It seemed that things would naturally take their course. The primary spirit dawn were burning unceasingly inside the heavenly source mirror. After that, they were gradually transforming into a long stream of spirit energies and were channeling inside his body. He was absorbing these spirit energies, transforming them into real elemental energy, and then attacking the barrier of the late stage of Sage Realm using this real elemental energy. He put his whole effort and didn't hold back even a bit. The observing person scripture was working at a crazy speed. It didn't stop even for a moment. The small universe was also frantically spinning inside his body. Those spirit energies derived from burning the primary spirit dawn were issuing buzzing sounds, and were gradually being absorbed by him. This seemingly endless supply of spirit energies was a big aid for Yi Shiwen. He didn't even need to convert them into a suitable form of energy for absorption. He needed the support of these spirit energies if he wanted his small universe to expand and grow bigger. The spirit energies gradually entered his small universe. Consequently, the small universe inside his body began to expand inch by inch. The solar system inside his body had fully taken shape. Moreover, it would improve every time he made a breakthrough. So, it would obviously improve by leaps and bounds when he'd make the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm. His real elemental energy gradually advanced towards the barrier of the late stage of Sage Realm under the shower of the spirit energies. Earlier, it had been difficult to advance towards the barrier. However, it had suddenly become a lot easier due to the support of the spirit energies. It seemed that an endless flood of spirit energies had broken out of a dam. A page of the ancient scripture was emanating dazzling divine rays above Yi Zaiwen's head. It seemed as if an ancient voice had been reading aloud these scriptures since forever. Meanwhile, Yi Shiwen was trying to gradually break through the shackles, and advance in a stronger direction. Time passed day by day. And, 2 months had come to pass soon enough. An increasing number of people had arrived in the Great Gas City as the time for opening of Great Gas Collar was getting increasingly close. So, the Great Gas City had become even more lively and crowded. The Great Gas Collar had spouted an increasing number of divine treasures with the 7th, 8th, and 9th vibrations. And, an increasing number of rumors about Great Gas Collar had also started to circulate. A large number of experts had arrived inside the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce as the time for the opening of Great Gas Collar was very close. Yi Shiwen also knew of these developments. He was submerged in the closed-door training. However, he had left a part of his soul outside for keeping watch on the affairs. Therefore, he knew of everything that was happening outside. Half-year's time seemed to have passed within the blink of an eye. Yi Shiwen had been inside the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce for more than half-year. In a room inside the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. Young Master Yi has been undergoing closed-door training for more than half-year. Why hasn't he come out yet? Yan Yunting said somewhat anxiously. The Great Gas Collar will open soon. It would be very difficult for him to reach the Great Gas Collar in time if it continues like this. You need to be patient. It's useless to worry. There is no problem even if he goes there a bit late, as I will also go to Great Gas Collar this time in order to get the green scaled fruit for your mother's treatment. I will certainly help you in finding it. When Yiren comforted Yan Yunting. She wasn't worried about when Yi Shiwen would come out. Thanks, elder sister Wen. Yan Yunting relaxed a bit. Suddenly, it seemed as if the entire world was left to shake. An earth-shattering sound came from afar, and shook the entire space. The atmosphere in the vicinity of the great gas collar had agitated. All the experts were stunned. The great gas collar has opened. The 9th vibration is over. Ha! 1 year. I've been waiting for this for 1 year. Finally, this great gas collar has opened now. The experts in the great gas city had become very excited. Countless experts transformed into streamers of light, and flew towards the great gas collar. Elder Sister Wen, what should we do now? It has opened. Yan Yunting asked somewhat anxiously. She had known that it was about to open soon. That was why she had been worried, and couldn't wait for Yi Xuan to come out. There's no need to wait for him. I will ask someone to deliver a message to him. We must be the first ones to reach there. We can't fall behind the others. Yan Yunting decisively said. I don't know when he will come out of the closed-door training. But, we don't have much time. All right. Yi Xuan had also felt that fierce vibration inside the secret underground chamber. He realized that the great gas collar must have opened. However, he couldn't afford to get distracted right now. After all, the small sun at the center of his universe was becoming increasingly hot. This wasn't the real sun. Rather, the true power of sun in his small universe had barely condensed inside his body as of yet. Basically, this was the representation of the light sources inside his body. And, it was the point of origin of all power sources in his universe. Yi Xuan had arrived at a crucial moment. He had been attacking the barrier for more than half-year. So, it had become very thin. And, he was only one strike away from breaking the barrier, and entering the late stage of Sage Realm now. He had burnt more than 300 million primary spirit dawn in this half-year's time. Every strike on the barrier had consumed more than 10 million primary spirit dawn. Other people would be shocked to the core if they came to know about this. In fact, they would rain curses on him for being such a spendthrift. He had attacked the barrier at least 30 times in the past 6 months. However, it hadn't broken. His foundation was extremely strong. So, the barrier was also very strong. In fact, it was 100 times stronger than that of an ordinary person. A lot of power was needed for each of his strikes on the barrier. Therefore, a huge amount of primary spirit dawn had been burning non-stop in order to provide him that unceasing supply of energy. He had used up a huge amount of primary spirit dawn. However, he had become habituated to this. His wealth came quickly, and also went quickly. But, this price was nothing if he could enhance his strength. However, Yi Xuan would never give up his profound foundation to decrease the problems in making a breakthrough. Ha! Yi Xuan exhaled a breath. Those energies had been condensed into a picture, a star chart to be precise. And, it seemed that a world itself had been condensed out of nowhere during this breath, as if done by a legendary god from the fables. If he said there is light, then there is light. Yi Xuan inhaled one breath, and absorbed the entire star chart. Then, he spouted it. Then, he inhaled it once again, and spat it out again. He repeated this process a number of times. It became bigger and better every time Yi Xuan inhaled it and spat it out. Bang! An imposing aura suddenly burst out of Yi Xuan's body. It was 10 times more potent than his aura from before. Yi Xuan felt that his entire power had surged out in full swing. He had finally entered the late stage of Sage Realm. This feeling was indescribable. He felt that he could blow away a senior expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm with a single fist attack now. The real elemental energy had flooded his body, and had finally overcome the obstacles. It had broken the barrier of the late stage of Sage Realm. Yi Xuan's aura broke through the barrier formation, and rushed towards the great gas chamber of commerce. He felt several tyrannical divine senses sweeping over there. They also swept over his body. However, a scarlet light suddenly surged out from inside his body, and shrouded him. The heavenly source mirror had automatically protected its owner. Those divine senses swept over his body, but left one after another. One of those divine senses was that of a person whom Wen Yiren had asked to pass on the message to Yishuan. Yishuan knew that Wen Yiren would have rushed to the Great Gas Collar by now. She also knew that she would have taken the people of Great Gas Chamber of Commerce with her. After all, it had been 3 days since the Great Gas Collar had opened. However, it didn't bother him since he didn't want to go there with Wen Yiren anyway. Being a solo operator was the best way for a person with so many secrets like him. Yishuan was very happy. However, the biggest reason for his happiness wasn't his own progress. Instead, it was Yimo's full recovery. He had been wandering here and there all these years for Yimo's treatment since he had wanted to try all kinds of methods to do so. Yi Zaiwen's biggest achievement in this more than half year's time was that he had helped Yimo in recovering his soul by giving him the 9-leaf dragon primary grass. Yimo's soul had completely recovered after refining and absorbing it for more than half year. Moreover, Yimo's level had increased as well. It has been half year. The Great Gas Collar has finally opened. Yishuan said. He was already late by 3 days. So, he didn't waste any time. He transformed into a streamer of light, and flew out of the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. The news of Yi Zaiwen's departure soon reached the Dominating Heavens dojo. Good, good, good. I have been waiting for you to come out. King Tai said in a cold voice and laughed. I knew that you wouldn't hide there for your entire life. King Tai's expression turned exceptionally sinister. His hatred for Yishuan knew no bounds. After all, Yishuan had made him lose face in front of Wen Yiren. King Tai's hadn't left for the Great Gas Collar even though it had opened. Instead, he had been waiting for Yishuan to come out. The hatred in his heart would only disappear after he had brutally killed Yishuan. Chapter 544. King Tai's hand trembled somewhat because of excitement. He had waited for almost half year for this day. He wanted to tear Yishuan into shreds so that he could make a meal out of him. King Tai had been rescued from the lair of the star beasts when he was younger. However, he himself had transformed into a beast after staying in that lair. He didn't feel like a beast on ordinary days. However, he would transform into a beast if he became angry. Yishuan had left the Great Gas City. His journey towards the Great Gas Collar had been smooth so far. However, he frowned at this moment since the entire place seemed too quiet. He knew about the Dominating Heaven dojo's influence. So, he knew that the news of his departure from the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce couldn't be concealed. However, everything looked very quiet right now. And, this seemed strange to him. Was King Tai such a generous person that he would let him go this time? It wasn't possible. Even King Tai wouldn't have believed it if someone had said this to him. Yishuan believed that King Tai was the kind of person who would take revenge even for a small grievance. After all, he had arrived after the auction to kill him because he had snatched away his items in the auction. Such a lawless man could dare to do anything. The more powerful a person is, the more likely it is for them to become lawless. Nothing could be done about this. Who would want to talk about equality with weaklings? Who would want to talk about giving them respect? Whoosh! 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 An incomparably sharp sound of breaking of space was suddenly heard as dozens of spear-like long arrows arrived while piercing the vast space. They surrounded Yishuan from all sides, thereby blocking off his escape routes. It was clear that this extremely proficient attack had been well coordinated. The opposite party hadn't unleashed their attack in a disorganized manner. The heavenly source mirror ferociously emitted a scarlet light from Yi Zaiwen's body. It shrouded him, and formed a scarlet boundary. Ding! 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 Those rushing arrows struck the scarlet barrier, and issued metal clanging sounds. They couldn't break the heavenly source mirror's defense. Go, kill him, a loud shout came from inside the void. Subsequently, more than a dozen figures appeared in the space around Yishuan. All of them were powerful sage experts with extremely tyrannical auras. In fact, the weakest among them were also at the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. They were headed by a middle-aged expert who had already entered the Sage Great Perfection realm. Dominating Heaven Dojo. Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes, and his countenance turned serious. Those people had the Dominating Heaven Dojo's logo on their bodies. King Tai had sent more than a dozen sage experts. He certainly had a disposition of seeking revenge even for a small grievance. Yi Shiwen had the strength of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm half-year ago. And, King Tai didn't know that he had made a breakthrough in these 6 months. Still, he had sent a Sage Great Perfection level expert to stop him. He was either extremely cautious, or he had given Yi Shiwen too much importance. It seemed that he was still very much angry because of what had happened in the auction half-year ago. However, Yi Ziwen's face exposed a trace of excitement. After all, he had recently made the breakthrough into the late stage of Sage Realm. So, he needed people to practice his newly obtained powers on. Moreover, he hadn't fought with an expert of Sage Great Perfection realm yet. He is still smiling. Isn't he scared? An expert of the Dominating Heaven Dojo burst into laughter, and said. He appeared to be somewhat crazy. The other experts also followed suit, and burst into laughter. It's useless to pretend to be naive. You will die this time. Nobody can save a person whom our young lord wants to kill. You would have been safe if you were still hidden inside the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. However, you will die since you've come out, the chief middle-aged expert who had reached the Sage Great Perfection realm said with a sinister grin on his face. Brothers, attack. We must give the head of this boy to the young lord when he arrives. That middle-aged expert's voice had barely faded when those experts of the Dominating Heaven Dojo attacked one after another. Different kinds of attacks swept out like waves. These grandiose attacks captured the entire space around Yi Shiwen. They swept all across, and crushed the void. However, that expert of the Sage Great Perfection realm merely stood there with his arms folded across his chest. He didn't mean to interfere. What was Yi Shiwen in his opinion? He was an insignificant expert of the late stage of Sage Realm, nothing more. He differed from him by several levels. He had personally arrived here not because King Tai gave very much importance to Yi Shiwen or because King Tai was very much cautious. Rather, it was because he wanted to curry favor with King Tai, the future lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo. Everyone in the dojo knew that King Tai was going to be the next lord. So, that expert of the Sage Great Perfection realm could enjoy endless wealth for several hundred years if he could curry favor with him. Many people in the dojo were under him because of his Sage Great Perfection level strength. So, he was regarded as a high-level person. In fact, the people of the dojo believed that the next lord of the dojo would have to rope him in. And, this may have been true for average people. But, this young lord was different. Everyone knew that this young lord had been captured by the star beasts in his childhood. Consequently, his temperament had become similar to that of a beast. He had been acting normal in these past years. However, that incident from his childhood had left a very profound imprint on him. His temperament had become incomparably violent, so much so that he would kill a person if that person disobeyed him. In fact, he would even eat their flesh later. This represented the so-called saying you will flourish if you obey, and die if you disobey. So, it would certainly be better for that Sage Great Perfection level expert if he could improve his relation with such a young lord in advance. However, he had brought people along with him. After all, he didn't wish to do this job with his own hands since he believed that Yi Shiwen was unworthy to be his opponent. Ha! Yi Shiwen lightly shouted. A big hand stretched out, and a golden light scattered in the surroundings. Then, the big hand grabbed and extinguished the attacks of those experts of the Dominating Heaven Dojo. In fact, it appeared as if a big hand had smashed a group of ants. Ha ha! Consider yourself worthy to face us. 3 experts of the late stage of Sage Realm rode on a small 3-echelon formation to outflank him. The first expert had a sword scar on his face. His complexion looked sinister as he laughed furiously. These people had been following King Tai for a very long time now. So, they had also become somewhat violent and fierce. Those 3 men rode on the small 3-echelon formation with great coordination. This formation looked simple. However, it contained the power of countless Tao principles. It wasn't easy to produce and make variations in most of these matrix formations such as univariate formation, yin-yang formation, 3-echelon formation, and 4-elements formations. Moreover, these matrix formations must be used in coordination with the user in order to display the greatest might. This was especially true for these 3 small barriers which needed concentric offensives as well as defensives in order to display their might to the peak. Their might was equivalent to that of 3 senior experts of the late stage of Sage Realm at their peak. Even an expert of the Sage Peak Realm could contend against only 1 or 2 experts of the late stage of Sage Realm. So, the strength of these 3 small barriers was even greater than that of an expert of the Sage Peak Realm. It wasn't as exquisite as the 5 elements Great Barrier of the 5 Huang brothers. However, it was already enough for these 3 men who were quickly moving back and forth. The combined attack of the 3 men issued a strange fluctuation. And, their murderous aura shook the entire universe as their offensives swept out towards Yi Shiwen like mighty tides. Ha! Yi Shiwen sneered. He looked like a god as he stood motionless in the middle of these violent attacks, and allowed them to hit him. Finally, he moved, and a fist swept out. This fist then transformed into a big star, and fell down on the small 3-echelon formation. And, the resulting scene looked like an image from a doomsday depiction. A terrifying force swept out in all directions. The space shook and ripped apart under the crushing pressure of this big star as dreadful waves of star power swept all across. The complexions of those 3 men changed significantly after Yi Ziwen's fist swept out. They could feel this extremely terrifying force. The small 3-echelon formation that they were riding on was unable to withstand this crushing blow even with the help of its inbuilt heavenly principles. Such a dreadful brute force, how can this man be so powerful? This thought appeared in the minds of those 3 men. They had already entered the late stage of Sage Realm a long time ago. In fact, they weren't far from the Sage Peak Realm. So, an ordinary expert of late stage of Sage Realm wasn't a match for them. Moreover, they had attacked together while riding on the small 3-echelon formation. They had never come across someone who could contend against them even after they had started to use the small 3-echelon formation. However, they hadn't expected that this guy who had been at the intermediate stage of Sage Realm half-year ago could possess such terrifying strength at present. However, they had finally experienced Yi Ziwen's incredible power at this time. The complexion of that chief middle-aged expert of the Sage Great Perfection Realm had also changed significantly by this time. He had realized that he had underestimated Yi Ziwen's strength. Yi Ziwen's strength was perhaps even more tyrannical than his. Stop! He couldn't continue to watch anymore, and attacked promptly. Consequently, boundless divine beams suddenly swept out towards Yi Shiwen. Bang! Yi Shiwen's fist had transformed into a big star, and had crushed the small 3-echelons formation. Then, that dreadful fist pressure had slammed upon the bodies of those 3 men. The defensive divine tools on the bodies of those 3 men activated within a split second. However, they got disintegrated immediately after. Ah! The weakest expert among those 3 couldn't endure Yi Ziwen's dreadful fist pressure. The pressure of that fist wasn't sharp. However, it was as heavy as a giant mountain. That man got crushed by the enormous pressure. He screamed loudly, and blood gushed out from every pore of his body. His skin wasn't able to endure the tremendous pressure, and ruptured as a result. His entire body was covered with blood at the moment. He looked like a person made of blood. Those other 2 men attacked at this time. They had finally understood that Yi Shiwen was far more powerful than what they had imagined. He had looked like an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm. However, they had come to realize how stupid they had been after they had started to fight him. After all, they would have killed him by now if he was an ordinary expert of the late stage of Sage Realm. A terrified look appeared in their eyes. They were thinking about the legendary Heaven's Pride experts who could fight people who were much more powerful than them. Now, They could only wait for that expert of sage great perfection realm to arrive, and save them. They had to put their entire effort, and constrain this man till then. Otherwise, nobody among them would survive. The combined attack of the two men fell from above like a star river. It transformed into a whirlpool in the sky, and swooped towards Yishuan. Bang! Yishuan stretched out his big hand. The golden light spread out in all directions. Then, the big hand grabbed the star river, and exploded it. Yishuan shot another punch immediately after. It transformed into a big star, and swept down. Bang! Suddenly, a massive explosion occurred. Both men trembled with horror under Yizaiwan's fist pressure. They tried to run away. However, they couldn't rival Yizaiwan's speed, and their heads got pounded upon by Yizaiwan's fist. Bang! Bang! Two muffled sounds were heard as their bodies got smashed by Yizaiwan's fist, and their blood got splattered in the space. Chapter 545, Cut the Weeds and Eliminate the Roots. Another expert of the late stage of Sage Realm had collapsed under the pressure of Yizaiwan's fist. The bones of his entire body had gotten crushed, and his soul had been shattered. It may have seemed that all of these things had happened over a long duration of time. However, all of it had happened within the blink of an eye. The attack of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm finally arrived in front of Yishuan. His attack wasn't slow. It hadn't taken a long time to reach Yishuan. However, it seemed slow compared to Yizaiwan's extremely fast speed. Yizaiwan's devil wings weren't just a magical power. They also contained a cleverly crafted agility skill that made Yizaiwan's attacks as fast as lightning. It took a long time to describe everything. However, Yishuan had defeated these experts in an instant. Yishuan didn't blink his eyes as he faced the attack of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm. A scarlet screen suddenly emerged from his body, and appeared in front of him. Bang! A loud sound was heard. It seemed as if the heaven and the earth had collided. This had been a terrifying collision. It had given rise to a dreadful wave which had swept out, and had smashed the vast space layer by layer. Everyone saw that Yishuan stood motionless in the space as the shock waves dispersed. He looked incomparably outstanding. Damn it! The complexion of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm changed. He hadn't expected that such a blunder would happen because of his late response. 3 sage experts had died within a split second. It was a big loss. Losing 3 sage experts could be considered as a disastrous loss even for a colossal force like the dominating Heaven Dojo. There weren't many sage experts in the universe. Moreover, it wasn't very easy to either create one or recruit one. Therefore, even the death of a single sage expert was considered a significant loss. However, the dominating Heaven Dojo had lost 3 sage experts in one fell swoop. The dojo lord wouldn't spare that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm if he returned without Yizaiwan's head. Kill him! The complexion of that middle-aged expert suddenly changed, and he shouted. The remaining 10 experts took out their long bows, and nocked their arrows. Then, they shot their arrows towards Yishuan. Whiz! 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 A barrage of arrows cut through the vast space like a giant dragon, and rushed towards Yishuan. Those experts had attacked with their entire strength. Their arrows formed a densely packed rain of arrow in the space. Yishuan coldly snorted while facing the approaching rain of arrow. Then, he shouted loudly, and the sound of the shout set off countless spirit energies. They appeared like an avalanche, and swept out after they had transformed into divine beams. Those arrows weren't able to approach Yishuan. They had been shattered on the way by those divine beams. Whoosh! A figure penetrated through the dense rain of arrows, and arrived in front of Yishuan. The middle-aged expert had taken advantage of the distraction caused by those arrows, and had arrived near Yishuan. Boy, I will send you on your way. Damn it! You've dared to cause so much trouble for me. I will make sure that you die without a burial ground. The countenance of that middle-aged expert turned ice-cold as he looked at Yishuan. He had rushed over with a dreadful real elemental energy. Consequently, a terrifying power had swept out, and this had opened numerous cracks in the void. The scene looked unusually terrifying. That expert of the Sage Great Perfection realm was only one step away from entering Sage Accomplished realm. He was only one step away from attaining the highest level of the Sage realm. Such a person had attacked with his entire strength. Obviously, his strength was incredibly dreadful. Bang! Yishuan stretched out his big hand, and blocked the offense of that expert of the Sage Great Perfection realm. You're very skillful. It's no wonder that you're so arrogant. However, you shouldn't have dared to oppose our young lord. You're like an ant in front of our dominating heaven dojo. A look of astonishment had appeared in the eyes of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection realm. After all, he hadn't thought that Yishuan would be able to stop his attack. This was completely beyond his expectations. However, soon his complexion became even more sinister. And he rushed out at an even faster speed. Then, his aura burst out of his body, formed a dreadful tide, and rushed towards Yishuan. He then brandished his palm. It smashed down, and shattered the void. He had attacked with his entire strength this time. He hadn't held back one bit. Bang! The palm of that middle-aged expert suddenly arrived in front of Yishuan. However, it got stopped by a golden wall that had been formed by the mighty golden waves under Yizaiwan's feet. It seemed that two big stars had collided. Both men had unleashed insane powers, and their violent collision had set off energy waves that surged everywhere. The face of that middle-aged expert finally exposed a look of terror. Earlier, he hadn't attacked with his entire strength, and his attack had been stopped by Yishuan. However, he had attacked with his entire strength this time. But, he still couldn't shake Yizaiwan's defense. In fact, his attack had seemed useless. It seemed as if a moth had thrown itself into fire. It's my turn now. Yishuan sneered. His entire vitality surged out of his body. His golden divinities surged up into incredible divine waves, and swept towards that middle-aged expert. Bang! That middle-aged expert wasn't able to escape. And the attack struck him head-on. Poof! He spouted a mouthful of blood, and his body went out flying upside down. In fact, his body had nearly gotten torn into two halves. Bang! Yishuan didn't stop after that middle-aged expert went out flying. Instead, he rushed after him while breaking the space. His figure transformed into a golden streamer, and violently dashed forward. The tremendous repulsive force propelled Yishuan forward as fast as lightning. He had covered a large distance in a flash, as if it were only a few inches. He instantly caught up with his target, and formed the Han seal. Bang! The Han seal fell down from above like a huge mountain. The void collapsed under the immense pressure. Bang! The body of that middle-aged expert got crushed under the tremendous pressure of Yizaiwan's attack. The entire space turned quiet. Everyone was blankly watching this scene before their eyes. They felt like idiots. They had never imagined that this could happen. They hadn't anticipated that the situation would turn out like this. The main reason why they had arrived here was that they had wanted to curry favor with King Tai by killing Yishuan. And, it should have been very easy since Yishuan was only an expert of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm half-year ago. Sage Realm was very difficult to reach for most of the human experts. However, it was no big deal for this group. They had brought more than a dozen Sage experts. In fact, their group even included a senior expert of the Sage Great Perfection realm. So, no matter how formidable their target was, he wouldn't be a match for them. It was precisely because of this that they had rushed here of their own accord while striving to be the first and fearing to be last. They were willing to do anything to curry favor with their future lord, and this non-risky mission was most welcome. However, they hadn't thought that things would eventually change like this. The most powerful expert among them couldn't stop Yizaiwan's attack, and had gone out flying. Run away quickly. Those remaining 10 experts couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't clear who had shouted. However, everyone began to turn around to escape. They had arrived here to curry favor with King Tai. But, they were indeed afraid of death. They didn't want to throw away their lives for the sake of the Doming Heaven Dojo. Their speed was quick. However, it wasn't faster than Yi Zaiwen's speed. Yi Shiwen went all out, and killed them rapidly. The space once again turned quiet in a matter of moments. In fact, there was a dead silence. Yi Shiwen had obtained some information from King Tai's subordinates. So, he knew that King Tai had transformed into a streamer of light, and had been shuttling through the space towards Yi Zaiwen's location. Hurry up! Hurry up! I want to tear that bastard with my own hands. King Tai fiercely said. It was hard to imagine how much hatred he possessed for Yi Shiwen. He wanted to tear Yi Shiwen into pieces, and devour his flesh. He knew that Yi Shiwen had already left Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. So, he was in a hurry. Also, he knew that his subordinates would have already confronted Yi Shiwen. Therefore, he wanted to reach there even more quickly. Otherwise, his men would have already killed Yi Shiwen by the time he arrived, and his half-year-long wait would go in vain. Make sure you wait. Sure you wait for me. I will rip you apart with my own hands. King Tai said while laughing fiercely. His speed was extremely fast. He had reached that battlefield rather quickly. However, he was surprised to see that the entire scene was in a mess, and a figure was sitting upright in the center of this scene. He looked like a Buddha who had been quietly cultivating, and had fused with the universe. Boy, you didn't try to escape. King Tai had recognized in a glance that this figure was Yi Zaiwen's. It could be said that he hated Yi Shiwen to the core. He had seen him only one time. However, he had such a deep impression of him that he could recognize him in one glance. Yi Shiwen stood up, and exposed a smile from the corner of his mouth. It looked somewhat ice-cold. I don't have the habit of putting aside danger. If there is a threat, then I must destroy it as soon as possible. Yi Shiwen had been waiting here for King Tai. He had come to know that King Tai was going to arrive here from those experts he had killed. So, he had decided that he would settle the deal with King Tai once and for all right here. He already knew that King Tai was the kind of person who would take revenge even for the slightest of grievances. He hated Yi Shiwen, and wanted to kill him just because he had snatched away an item from him in the auction. Such a person would do anything if left unattended. This represented the so-called saying cut the weeds and eliminate the roots. It would be better to attack first and kill him instead of waiting for him to attack. Ha 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 ha. You've got some courage. King Tai furiously laughed. His ominous power shook the space in the surroundings, and shattered it. But, it's fine. The heaven is helping me. Now, you die. This was the ominous power of King Tai. He had acquired it when he had lived in seclusion among the demon beasts for a long time. He was also an expert of Sage Great Perfection realm. However, he and that middle-aged expert weren't on same level. There was a difference of cloud and mud between them. He looked like the king of demon beasts in this starry space. He looked incomparably ferocious. Chapter 546. King Tai shouted loudly, and summoned a 2-meter-tall star beast. Its head was like that of a leopard, its body was like that of a tiger, and its tail was like that of a scorpion. Its entire body was blood red. It looked exceptionally ferocious. Yi Shiwen had seen the record of this strange star beast in the ancient books. It was the combination of 3 animals: leopard, tiger, and scorpion. It wasn't known to which species of demon beasts it belonged. All the fierce beasts of the world, like the demon beasts, the star beasts, and so on, followed a simple principle: the purer the blood, the more ferocious the beast is. The human race also followed this rule. The men who possessed the blood of the ancient humans were awfully powerful. However, this hybrid beast was clearly an exception to this rule. It looked insolent and fierce as it raised its head and roared. Its roar shook the entire surrounding space. It was incomparably dreadful. This star beast possessed an incredibly ominous dominance. It looked like the king of the beasts. It looked up and stood straight. Then, it trod with its 4 claws, and ripped apart the space. This fight had attracted many experts here. A lot of experts had left for the Great Gas Collar. However, some of the experts believed that they wouldn't get any good opportunities to obtain divine treasures at the Great Gas Collar. After all, those fortuitous encounters came with brutal killings. They either believed that they didn't possess enough strength or they believed that they didn't have good luck. Basically, they were just too ordinary. The majority of them were the experts of the Great Gas City who knew everything about the Great Gas Collar. Therefore, they didn't want to go there to throw away their lives. A lot of people had heard that King Tai had been talking about killing someone in the past 6 months. That someone had turned out to be Yi Shiwen. Now, Yi Shiwen had come out, and King Tai had set out to kill him. And, these people didn't wish to miss this epic confrontation. Many people had arrived here one after another. They looked from afar that the ominous energy of a star beast was boiling in space. My goodness, isn't that the hybrid beast that has been accompanying King Tai for many years now? It is said that many people had gone to suppress the group of tiger leopard scorpions after King Tai had fallen into their group. However, they had seen that this tiger leopard scorpion was calmly accompanying King Tai when they arrived there. It is said that this tiger leopard scorpion is of a different nature from birth. It is inherently bold and powerful. Of course, there's no doubt about it. It looks extremely terrifying. It seems that it can tear the world to shreds. Yi Zaiwen's complexion turned serious. This hybrid beast didn't lack in strength when compared to King Tai. In fact, this demon beast of variant origin had also reached the Sage Great Perfection realm. It seemed that it would be very difficult to deal with it. Kill! King Tai stepped onto that hybrid beast, and shouted loudly. The spirit energies of the entire space began to vibrate crazily. They vibrated and twisted. The scene looked extremely terrifying. King Tai pulled out heavenly and painted halberd, and held it in his hand. It issued a dreadful charm. Yi Shiwen snorted as he saw this. Then, the golden vitality in his entire body surged out. It transformed into an energy pillar, and soared up. Then, that energy pillar swept all across in an overwhelming manner. There wasn't even a bit of fear on Yi Zaiwen's face as he faced King Tai, who rushed towards him like a small mountain. In fact, he felt somewhat excited deep in his heart. That expert of Sage Great Perfection realm whom he had fought earlier was no challenge when compared to King Tai. Yi Shiwen spread out his hands at this time. Then, he suddenly clenched his fists, and transformed them into a big star. Then, this big star swept forward with a loud rumbling sound. Rumble. The big star collided in the sky with the halberd. And, this collision issued a metal clanging sound. The tip of King Tai's halberd and Yi Zaiwen's fist pressure collided. Both of them had attacked with their entire strength. King Tai's body got swept away by a dreadful astral wind. His complexion turned slightly discolored. He hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen could be so powerful. After all, he had believed that Yi Shiwen was merely an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm, nothing more. However, Yi Shiwen was fighting with him barehanded. Moreover, it seemed that his strength was incredible, and so was his potential. In fact, it could be said that he would develop to a great extent if he was left alive. The entire starry space suddenly exploded. The spot of collision in the space had already transformed into smoke and dust. Numerous cracks had appeared even at faraway places. The complexions of those experts who had dared to arrive here to witness this fight changed as soon as they saw this. They felt that they might get to see this kind of a fight only once in their entire lifetime. However, what had shocked them the most was that this unknown boy before their eyes had turned out to be a match for King Tai. Moreover, he was fighting with King Tai unarmed. This was what King Tai used to do with others in the past. He often used to take on his opponents like a beast by relying only upon his tyrannical body. However, the situation had reversed in this instance. King Tai's complexion slightly changed. He had come across such a tough opponent for the first time in his life. His opponent was fighting with him barehanded. This meant that his body was extremely tyrannical. Perhaps it was even more tyrannical than his. Otherwise, how could an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm fight with an expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm? You've got some trick up your sleeves. It's no wonder that you've dared to oppose me. However, it's still useless. Nobody can save you. Today, you shall die. King Tai furiously said. A proud and cruel grin appeared on his face. Yi Xuan's eyes were ice-cold at the moment. King Tai possessed outstanding strength. He deserved to be one of the 4 heroes of Great Gas. He was indeed strong enough to rule among his peers. However, Yi Xuan didn't have the slightest intention of retreating. He raised his hand, and clenched his fist. He then said, I will take on whoever dares to fight with me. This day shall be your death anniversary next year. That's very audacious of you. King Tai burst into laughter as his halberd pointed towards Yi Xuan once again. He then attacked carrying a dreadful imposing aura. He rushed forward sitting on the hybrid beast, and shattered the void. And, a wave of murderous aura erupted to complemented King Tai's tyranny. King Tai's halberd sketched a long imaginary shadow in the space. It suddenly issued countless halberd beams, which went flying towards Yi Xuan. Yi Xuan simply disregarded it. A fist swept down, and transformed into a huge star. The huge star crushed everything in its path. Those halberd beams bombarded on top of this star. However, a burst of golden light suddenly appeared in that instant, and annihilated those halberd beams. Consequently, the halberd beams disappeared without a trace after giving rise to a few ripples. How is it possible? King Tai didn't dare to believe what he had just seen. What is his body made of? How can it be so tough? A bad feeling appeared in his mind at this time. However, Yi Xuan didn't give him a chance to react. And, he quickly launched another attack. Each of his fists pounded like a big star. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth, and set off strong energy storms. This was the most unusual fight. Both sides had gone all out. The speed of their attacks was so quick that it had dazzled the majority of experts who had been witnessing the fight from afar. In fact, they couldn't even tell how many times these 2 individuals had clashed in that instant. Clang! 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 The 2 individuals attacked each other, and metal clanging sounds were issued. However, it seemed Yi Xuan had suppressed King Tai by using his fist alone. Bang! Suddenly, a huge explosion sounded. King Tai retreated several times in front of everyone while remaining seated atop his hybrid beast. In fact, he had nearly fallen off the hybrid beast. He spouted mouthful of blood, a big and round hole had been opened on his chest. Moreover, his metal armor had also been shattered. In fact, he would have died if that metal armor hadn't been protecting his body. King Tai stared at Yi Xuan in a malicious manner. He hadn't paid attention to Yi Xuan at first. He had only wanted to tear him into shreds, and devour his flesh thereafter. However, he had realized how wrong he had been after he had fought with Yi Xuan. He had always fought with everyone depending solely upon his tyrannical body. People used to say that he was a star beast in the form of a human. He had always toyed with his opponent to his heart's content. However, his strongest aspect looked extremely weak in front of Yi Xuan. In fact, his most tyrannical aspect had been rendered useless because he had come across an opponent with a more powerful body than his own. And, that was why he was suffering right now. His strongest aspect had been nullified. So, what could he depend on now? He had become aware of the terror of Yi Zaiwen's ferocious body, just like those demon beasts that had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands. His attacks couldn't shake Yi Zaiwen's defense. In fact, it seemed as if he were a golden god of war. However, Yi Xuan hadn't even paid any attention to his defenses. Moreover, it had been his simplest of attacks that King Tai had been finding trouble coping up with. King Tai had tried very hard to injure Yi Xuan. However, he hadn't been able to do so. On the other hand, Yi Zaiwen's casual attacks had injured him to the point of leaving him to vomit blood. Are you okay? King Tai's hybrid beast opened its mouth and asked. I'm fine. King Tai clenched his teeth, and somehow suppressed the vitality that was surging inside his body. However, he still continued to spout blood because of his wounded vitality. I'll kill him. I'll rip him to shreds. Yi Shiwen was standing in the void. He looked average, and nowhere near spectacular. However, he carried a terrifying and outstanding aura. Everyone had come to feel it, especially after he had completely repulsed King Tai. King Tai looked at Yi Shiwen. His eyes were ice-cold like electricity. They were brimming with killing intention and intense hatred. Bang! King Tai lifted his halberd. The space exploded, and halberd beams swept out. His murderous aura looked boundless. Such battle prowess had surpassed the level of an ordinary expert of Sage Great Perfection realm. Everyone was terrified when they saw this. After all, such fighting strength was enough to slaughter all of them at the same time. The most powerful person among them was merely an expert of the late stage of Sage realm. After all, the experts who were stronger than the ones in this group had already entered the Great Gas Collar. It was impossible for the ordinary experts that were present here to not get terrified while witnessing such fighting strength. However, what made them even more terrified was that King Tai, who possessed such incredible fighting strength, had been forced into a disadvantageous position by Yi Shiwen. In fact, King Tai had been brutally battered by Yi Zaiwen's attacks. Moreover, he had been left exhausted and distressed. In fact, the experts who were witnessing this fight had begun to believe that Yi Shiwen was as terrifying as an ancient killing god. Kill! King Tai's murderous aura burst out. He knew that he had fallen into a disadvantageous position. However, he didn't become weak. On the contrary, his killing intention rose even higher. He then stormed towards Yi Shiwen while carrying the long halberd in his hand. He felt that he needed to seize this opportunity to kill Yi Shiwen. It seems that you haven't understood it yet. Yi Shiwen smirked. There was no doubt that King Tai was very powerful. However, he couldn't pose any threat to him unless he was a Heaven's Pride expert of the same realm. What was a Heaven's Pride expert? They were the so-called peerless geniuses who appeared one in millions. The true martial university had a few Heaven's Pride experts among its millions of disciples. However, those millions of experts who had arrived in the true martial university were the best ones among God knows how many experts in the southern region. Moreover, even those experts had been selected from countless ordinary people. It needn't be mentioned that the southern region was so huge that it was hard to count how many people populated it. It didn't matter how big the Great Gas City was. After all, it was only a city, nothing more. It wasn't on the same level as the southern region. Chapter 547, Slaughters King Tai. Yi Shiwen possessed the fighting strength of a Heaven's Pride expert. In fact, he could be called a peerless genius among the Heaven's Pride experts. There had been several Heaven's Pride experts in the southern region in the past 100 years. In fact, the Heaven's Pride experts who had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands would have become more terrifying if they had grown up to this day. King Tai might have pulled Yi Shiwen into a bitter struggle if he was also a Heaven's Pride expert. Yi Shiwen sneered. A big hand stretched out, and fell down from above. It then transformed into a great seal, and swept down. Bang! The great seal pounded upon King Tai's halberd. A terrifying force traveled through the halberd, and charged into his body. Consequently, it became a little difficult for King Tai to hold the halberd since his palms had been cracked open to bleed. Moreover, the legs of the hybrid beast on which King Tai was sitting had also bent because of the attack. It nearly fell to its knees as a result, but its movement crushed the void underneath. King Tai had finally discovered that his martial arts accomplishment was nothing in comparison to Yi Shiwen. Moreover, there was a huge disparity in his level of martial Dao achievement as well. The disparity wasn't as big as the disparity between humans and ants. However, it was as much as the difference between cloud and mud. It could also be compared to the disparity between an infant and a sturdy adult. Now, die. Blood rain killing demon. King Tai roared. He urged out the entire real elemental energy in his body. After all, he needed to turn the tide in his favor at any cost. And, he had to go all out for this. There was no other option. His aura began to surge up, and the void in the periphery got distorted in its entirety. The lower half of his body transformed into a pool of blood, and that hybrid beast got integrated into it. Consequently, his fighting strength suddenly turned up a notch. Damn it. Boy, I'm not willing to accept that I can't kill you. I am the best. I'm the head of the 4 heroes of Great Gas. Who do you think you are to be challenging me? King Tai's real elemental energy burst out, and disintegrated the void. The unleashed energy contained an incredible divine power. Yi Zaiwen's complexion turned slightly cold while facing King Tai's sudden outbreak. However, his gaze seemed simply unaffected. The page of ancient god scripture flew out behind him. It seemed as if he was reading the god scripture that had been passed down since ancient times. A divine beam burst out, and dyed Yi Zaiwen's entire figure golden. He now looked like a golden god of war. It's useless. You're no match for me. What 4 heroes of Great Gas? It's laughable. Yi Shiwen coldly replied. He didn't care about the Great Gas 4 heroes. He would have crushed them like ants if he possessed the same cultivation time as them. He wasn't scared of the Great Gas 4 heroes. However, he would be somewhat wary if the forces backing them attacked him. Yi Zaiwen's fist transformed into a big star, fell down, and struck King Tai's body. King Tai clenched his teeth, and suddenly released an incredible scarlet light from his body. The scarlet light transformed into a sky-devouring blood beast. In fact, it looked like an ancient beast from the legends that could swallow the stars. It then suddenly rushed up to attack. Rumble. Yi Zaiwen's big star transformed into numerous swordlights as he faced this dreadful insurrection. And, that blood beast got cut into 2 halves on the spot. The beast transformed into an astral wind in the void, and was then swept away like a mighty wave. King Tai had nearly transformed into a fierce beast during this attack. Moreover, countless scales had grown over his body. Suddenly, the scarlet halberd streaked through the vast space. It carried an invincible ominous energy, and instantly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to kill him. King Tai's muscles began to rupture. It was evident that he couldn't maintain this beastly form for long. Blood splashed out from his body, and he transformed into a blood man. In addition, his complexion turned exceptionally fierce. Half of the reason for this transformation was his immense hatred for Yi Shiwen, while the other half was his unbearable pain which had converted into immense power. This was to be his last as well as most powerful strike. A sword appeared in Yi Zaiwen's palm. He then slashed with it. The strike transformed into a swordlight and swept out. It rushed towards that scarlet halberd. Buried Heaven Sword. Yi Shiwen had already mastered the sword technique of Buried Heaven Sword to the bone. So, even his single effortless sword strike was able to unleash a dreadful amount of power. Bang! King Tai's strength had reached its zenith. And, it seemed that he would break the world. However, Yi Zaiwen's strength was still more formidable. King Tai's body got blown away by Yi Shiwen once again. Moreover, his body was being torn apart by Yi Zaiwen's horrifying power. In fact, it had nearly been ripped apart by now. Yi Shiwen streaked across the space, and instantly arrived in front of King Tai. The incredible magical prowess of devil wings had manifested to the extreme. Yi Shiwen stretched out his hand. It suddenly transformed into an exceptionally huge seal, and slammed down on King Tai. Everyone was stunned as they witnessed the scene before their eyes. King Tai's strength had been insane before he had transformed. And, his strength had increased by a notch after transforming into a beast. However, he still hadn't been able to stand his ground in front of Yi Shiwen. Moreover, he had been routed very effortlessly. This showed that Yi Shiwen was far too powerful. It's over. King Tai is done for. He looks like an infant in front of this man even after unleashing his utmost power. He's far inferior to this man. They aren't on the same level. It's a pity. King Tai is a peerless genius of our great gas city. He might have had the opportunity to enter the great sage realm in the future. However, he is going to fall here. King Tai always bullies others by abusing the power of the dominating heaven dojo. So, it is a good thing that he's going to die now. This man is reckless and unruly. He has dared to resort to extreme methods against King Tai. The dominating heaven dojo isn't going to leave this matter be. This will shake the entire great gas city. Most of the spectators didn't have a favorable opinion of King Tai's chances. After all, King Tai didn't have anything that could give these people even a bit of hope about his chances against Yi Zaiwen's unimaginable strength. Stop! A furious shout came from the great gas city. All the spirit energies gathered in the surroundings suddenly scattered like clouds. Then, a big hand swept out from the great gas city. It ripped through the vast space, and rushed towards the battlefield. This attack carried immensely dreadful strength, and the power of boundless principles. Its might couldn't be matched. And, this development instantly left everyone terrified. Great Sage. This scary Great Sage coercion made a lot of experts weak in the knee. They didn't dare to disobey. After all, this was the true power of Great Sage. There would be no suspense about the outcome if an ordinary sage expert clashed with a great sage expert. It would be impossible for ordinary sage experts to contend against a great sage expert because they weren't on the same level as a great sage expert. This is dominating Heaven Dojo's lord. Yi Xuan felt that overwhelming imposing aura. Moreover, the killing intention was hardly concealed. In fact, it seemed that it would engulf him whole. Humph! Yi Xuan snorted. This dominating Heaven Dojo's lord must have been observing King Tai since the beginning. He must have been considering Yi Xuan as King Tai's whetstone. Therefore, he hadn't done anything so far. However, he had now seen that King Tai had fallen into a disadvantageous position. Moreover, he was also about to die at Yi Zaiwen's hands. So, he couldn't stop himself from attacking. However, Yi Xuan wasn't the kind of person who would leave the root of the trouble behind. King Tai's personality wouldn't allow him to be grateful to Yi Xuan if Yi Xuan didn't kill him. Instead, he would harbor a grudge against him, and would think about methods to kill him. Bang! King Tai screamed as his body got crushed by Yi Xuan. Then, his body transformed into a mass of blood fog. And, his soul got shattered. You have a death wish. The dominating Heaven Dojo's lord became infuriated when he saw his beloved disciple being killed. He had been nurturing King Tai for many years so that he could succeed him. He had put mental and physical efforts for many years to nurture King Tai, and had made him one of the 4 heroes of Great Gas. Moreover, King Tai was expected to become a great sage in the future. However, the entirety of his efforts had gone in vain since King Tai had been killed by Yi Xuan. Everything had gone in vain. So, he would now have to spend several hundred years more to cultivate another person. And, this new talent still might not be able to achieve King Tai's level of strength. Moreover, the other 3 heroes of Great Gas would have grown to God knows what extent till then. This was the most awful thing that could have happened. A dreadful imposing aura soared in the space above the Great Gas City. And, a silhouette carrying a boundlessly evil aura swept towards the battlefield. His big hand had already ripped through the vast space, and was coming towards Yi Xuan to grab him. It seemed that it would soon crush Yi Xuan to death. Whoosh! Yi Zaiwen's speed was extremely quick. He transformed into a golden flash in an instant, and moved several hundred kilometers away. Bang! The place where Yi Xuan had stood a moment ago exploded. The space collapsed, and chaos leaked out from it. Then, the space exploded. It was like the aftermath of Doomsday. It looked insanely terrifying. Yi Xuan would have been crushed to death if he hadn't escaped so quickly. After all, he was merely an expert of the late stage of Sage realm. Therefore, he differed from the great sage by several realms. So, he could have gotten crushed to death very easily. The disparity between Sage realm and Great Sage realm was bigger than the disparity between Legendary realm and Sage realm. In fact, there was a difference of cloud and mud between them. They were simply not on same level. Boy, you will die. I won't let you off. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo roared like an injured beast. He had entered Great Sage realm many years ago. And, nobody had ever dared to act like this against him till now. In addition, everyone used to pay respect to his disciples wherever they went. Nobody had ever dared to resort to extreme methods against his disciples. He had nurtured his successor for so many years. However, that would-be successor was now dead. So, it was certain that he would go insane and harbor an enormous grievance against his would-be successor's killer. It was hard to imagine how fast a great sage's attack could be. After all, this great sage's attack had crossed an enormous chunk of space in an instant to arrive close to the battlefield. Yi Xuan had felt that an aura that initially had been very far away had arrived close to him in an instant. A great sage expert was very scary. However, it wasn't that Yi Xuan didn't know this. After all, he had made a narrow escape from the hands of a great sage expert of the Fire Cloud Cave in the past. He had been attacked several times that day, but he had still managed to escape. His strength had certainly increased significantly from back then. However, he knew that he was still far from being a match for a ferocious expert of the Great Sage realm. Therefore, he immediately opened his devil wings, transformed into a streamer of light, and flew into the distance. Chapter 548. Bang! 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 A golden streamer was randomly shuttling around in the space at a great speed. And, a big hand was unceasingly pressing down from above. The big hand shattered the space and transformed it into a mass of chaos every time it pressed down. It appeared as if this big hand was giving birth to a new world each time it slammed down. Ah! Yi Xuan heard the roar of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo coming from behind him. The spiritual power contained in that big hand was tightly locked on his body. His pair of golden wings fluttered faster and faster. Great sage experts were extremely ferocious. They could cover 1,000 miles in a single step. Their incredible speed was simply beyond anyone's imagination. It would be useless for an ordinary sage expert even if they tried to escape as fast as possible. A great sage could catch up with them in an instant. However, Yi Xuan was no ordinary sage expert. Moreover, his speed would become very high whenever Head used his devil wings. In fact, Head looked like a golden lightning when Head used his devil wings. This was how he had managed to escape from the hands of a great sage expert even when he only possessed the strength of semi-sage level. However, he was considered a super expert in sage realm now. It wasn't clear how much his strength had increased. Moreover, his devil wings had reached a whole new level as well. He had been chased non-stop by a great sage expert in the past. In fact, he had come close to being grasped on several occasions. However, his speed had become even faster now. The rage of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo had soared. He roared again and again. However, he couldn't catch Yi Xuan. He was missing to catch him by a bit every time. Yi Xiwen's present attitude was much more calm and confident as compared to when he had been chased by that great sage expert of the Fire Cloud Cave. However, the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo chased Yi Xuan continuously. He wasn't willing to give up. It seemed that he wouldn't spare Yi Xuan even if he had to pursue him to the end of the world. It felt that he would definitely tear him to shreds since he had killed his beloved disciple. Yi Xuan, quickly go towards the great gas collar. He won't go in there. Yi Mo promptly reminded. Yi Xuan nodded. However, Yi Mo didn't need to say that since Yi Xuan had already been flying in the direction of the great gas collar. Yi Xuan had slaughtered King Tai. So, the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo wasn't going to spare him. In fact, it seemed that he would pursue him to the world's edge. The devil wings were too awesome, and he didn't need to stop even for a bit. However, he didn't wish to spend his remaining life being chased like this. Therefore, he could go only in the direction of the great gas collar, since the great sage experts didn't dare to enter that place. However, the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo made out Yi Zaiwen's intentions soon enough. And he flew into a rage when he figured out that Yi Shiwen wanted to enter the great gas collar. He would escape if I let him enter the great gas collar. And I won't be able to take revenge on this vile murderer who has killed my disciple. Therefore, he tried to increase his speed. However, his speed had already reached to its limit. So, his speed didn't increase further no matter how much he tried. And he kept falling short of Yi Shiwen by an inch every time as a result. He had obviously become furious. He didn't know what kind of agility technique Yi Shiwen possessed that had enabled an ordinary sage expert like him to escape from the hands of a great sage expert. This seemed like a big miracle which would shake the entire starry space if declared publicly. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo roared again and again. However, he couldn't catch Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked like a golden streamer that was far too fast. Moreover, it seemed that his momentum and power weren't reducing with time. Yi Zaiwen's foundation was very deep. And his real elemental energy was even more profound. Even an expert of sage great perfection realm might not have such profound cultivation. So, it wasn't clear how long it would take for his energy to exhaust. In fact, he had all kinds of spirit dawn for replenishing his real elemental energy. He had certainly consumed a huge amount of primary spirit dawn in these 6 months. However, a huge amount of it was still left in his stock. In addition, he also had a lot of medicinal pills in his stock for replenishing his real elemental energy. So, it was basically impossible for him to exhaust the entirety of his resources. A lot of people were on the trajectory to the Great Gas Collar from Great Gas City. They saw that a flustered-looking senior great sage expert was chasing an ordinary sage expert in exasperation. The sound of his roar surged up like thunder, and shook the surroundings. A chunk of the space collapsed every time the big hands slammed down. The scene looked extremely dreadful. It was hard to tell how many people had been affected by this chase so far. After all, the mere aftershocks from this chase had injured many sage experts. Bang! Both men had reached the borderline of the Great Gas Collar. The Great Gas Collar looked different from earlier when it had been blockaded by the poisonous gas. Now, it had finally revealed a bit of its true appearance. However, some areas still had a weak presence of the poisonous fog. The ordinary people in these areas were able to enter the Great Gas Collar. However, the collar looked like a giant continent. Whoosh! Yi Shiwen suddenly arrived while streaking across the space like a golden streamer, and vanished into the Great Gas Collar without even stopping for a moment. Roar! The sound of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo's furious roar reverberated behind him. He had gone mad in rage since Yi Shiwen had escaped. Yi Shiwen had entered the Great Gas Collar. So, the dojo lord couldn't pursue him any further. Phew! Yi Shiwen let out a sigh of relief. He had planned how he would escape if he were to come across a great sage expert. However, he heaved a sigh of relief after having executed that plan. There is a difference of heaven and earth between Great Sage Realm and Sage Realm. They simply aren't on the same level. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo is just at the initial stage of Great Sage Realm. However, he is as awe-inspiring as a god. Yi Shiwen said this. He still had a lingering fear in his heart. A great sage-level expert was far more powerful than what he had imagined. He will definitely send people to blockade this Great Gas Collar. He won't let you escape very easily. Yi Mo warned. The Great Gas Collar was very big. However, it wasn't impossible for these super experts to blockade it. Yi Shiwen developed a headache as he thought all this. An ordinary sage expert would certainly be screwed if he got chased by a great sage expert who was dead set on not letting him go. Therefore, this was only a temporary escape. He would still have to face him later. However, it's not impossible to deal with it. Emo sneered and said. You speed up the process of refining the soul of the star colossus. Your blood slave can grow up quickly to the initial stage of half-step Great Sage realm that way. And, it will be able to display the might of Great Sage level by controlling the corpse of the star colossus once it's there. Yi Shiwen wasn't the only one who had made a fast progress. Yi Shiwen had surely made the breakthrough into the late stage of Sage realm, but that blood slave had already reached the Sage accomplished realm. In fact, it had made much quicker progress than Yi Shiwen. The blood slave itself was formed by absorbing the star colossus soul. Therefore, the so-called bottleneck, realization of realm, and so on didn't matter for the blood slave since its growth was based on direct borrowing. Its cultivation increased by absorbing the star colossus. So, the quicker it would absorb, the faster it would progress. The blood slave could now display the strength of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm when it controlled the corpse of the star colossus. However, its body would become even more tyrannical than Yi Shiwen's with the aid of the star colossus if it itself could progress to the initial stage of half-step Great Sage realm. And, it could contend against the experts of initial stage of Great Sage realm at that time. However, it was easier said than done. The blood slave wouldn't need to enter the Great Sage realm. However, half-step Great Sage realm still had those two words in it, Great and Sage. So, it was still very challenging. Fortunately, the blood slave didn't have to face any realm barrier. Therefore, the task could be accomplished as long as the rate of absorption was accelerated. Anyway, I've shaken off this guy for now. Yi Shiwen ignored the Lord of the Dominating Heaven dojo as he continued to roar in the background. Yi Shiwen then rushed inside. Brother, please wait for a moment, a crisp yet elegant voice came from behind. Yi Shiwen turned around to see an approximately 20 years old woman. Her skin was as fair as snow. Her eyes looked like pools of limpid autumn water as they flickered like the stars in the sky. Her fine black hair hung over her shoulder, and an ivory silk long skirt outlined her graceful body. In addition, she had draped another watercolored slim-fit robe which had embroidery of light cyan threads at the collar and cuffs. She wore a pair of shoes which were also cyan in color. And, each of those shoes had a light pink lotus embroidered over them. The lotuses looked prominent yet elegant. Yi Shiwen frowned as he saw that woman slowly emerging from the void. He also became a bit vigilant since he had discovered that this woman possessed the strength of Sage Great Perfection realm. In fact, she was no less than King Tai. What's the matter? Yi Shiwen asked. Please forgive this younger sister for being presumptuous. This younger sister is Ding Tong. I've just seen your outstanding might. Even a great sage expert was unable to deal with you. I would like to invite you to join our team. The woman, Ding Tong, faintly smiled and replied. You saw that? Yi Shiwen frowned, and looked at Ding Tong. His eyes flashed a few times. He suddenly became vigilant in his heart. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven dojo couldn't come here. However, it didn't mean that no one from the Dominating Heaven dojo could come here. There were a lot of experts in the Dominating Heaven dojo. Some of them had even reached Sage Accomplished realm. And, he believed that those Sage Accomplished level experts wouldn't let him off if they found him. In fact, they wouldn't rest until they had hunted him down. The experts of Sage Accomplished realm weren't as powerful as the experts of Great Sage realm. However, Yi Shiwen still couldn't contend against them unless he took out the blood slave while it was controlling the star colossus. However, he reckoned that the blood slave would get affected by the great gas collar if he took it out here. It would then get ganged up and destroyed by his enemies. After all, the great gas collar didn't allow anyone with the strength above the sage realm to enter its boundaries. Yi Shiwen would still manage to escape. However, it would be very troublesome. Don't misunderstand me. We and the Dominating Heavens dojo aren't together. In fact, we don't even belong to the Great Gas City. Ding Tong explained. She was afraid that Yi Shiwen had misunderstood her. After all, she had seen him escaping from the hands of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven dojo just now. She clearly knew how much the difference between Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm was. However, Yishuan had escaped from the hands of a great sage expert. So, he had to be a famous person. In fact, he had to be a top player in the sage realm. Moreover, it was also clear that Yishuan was a fierce person. Therefore, it would be very bad for her if she messed up and he misunderstood her for a disciple of the dominating heaven dojo. Our team isn't from the River Shore Star Field. We have come from another star field. We have arrived at Great Gas Collar in order to make some profit. Would you like to join us? Ding Tong asked. Yishuan raised his eyebrows. He was very familiar with the method of such small groups. There was advantage as well as disadvantage in joining them. The advantage was that it would be safer to operate in a group of people inside the Great Gas Collar. However, the disadvantage was that one might die if the other group members had evil intentions. However, Yishuan didn't care about this. Even an expert of sage accomplished realm couldn't stop him from escaping. Anyway, he hadn't gotten the time to collect information regarding the Great Gas Collar because of King Tai. So, he could also obtain some information by joining this team. Yishuan nodded after he had thought this. Very well then. Chapter 549. The two individuals didn't hesitate, and flew towards the depths of the Great Gas Collar after Yishuan had agreed. I have invited you so presumptuously because there's a tomb in the depths of the Great Gas Collar. It is said that this place contains a secret that can help a sage expert to enter the Great Sage Realm. Ding Tong explained. Yishuan raised his eyebrows. A bright light glittered in his eyes. The Sage Realm was an extravagant hope for the majority of experts. However, every sage expert wanted to enter the Great Sage Realm. Sage experts could merely defend themselves in the starry space. However, great sage experts were considered the powerhouses of the starry space. In fact, they were capable enough of reigning over a region. The Great Sage Realm could be attained easily by the experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm and Sage Accomplished Realm. However, the star field was like a natural barrier. So, it was much more difficult to make the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm in the star field as compared to on a planet. The promotion from the legendary realm to the Sage Realm could be said to cause the transformation of body. However, the promotion from Sage Realm to Great Sage Realm led to the transformation of soul by this analogy. And, this transformation would be completed only after one had entered the Great Sage Realm. However, many people have obtained this news. So, a chaotic fight between exceptional heroes is imminent. Therefore, we hope to find as many experts as possible for support. Ding Tong said. Yishuan nodded. Countless people would have gone crazy if there was indeed a method to enter the Great Sage Realm. Moreover, those who have dared to enter the Great Gas Collar are undoubtedly super experts of the Sage Realm. And, all of them would love to enter Great Sage Realm. It is said that someone had obtained this treasure the last time this Great Gas Collar had opened. And, that person reached the Great Sage Realm very quickly after going out of the Great Gas Collar. Ding Tong added. Therefore, many experts would be arriving for this secret this time. In fact, our team also has a lot of experts. I hope Brother Yi will join hands with me in the fight when the time comes. Ding Tong glanced at Yishuan with her sparkling eyes, and said. Yishuan suddenly felt that something wasn't right. What kind of a situation is this? This Ding Tong obviously doesn't trust the people of her own group. Moreover, she wants an outsider like me to join her in the fight. Isn't it kind of funny? It's evident how wary they are of each other. It's no wonder that they've dared to add more people to the group. Yishuan couldn't help but become more vigilant after having thought this. Yishuan had known that the situation at the Great Gas Collar was going to be complicated. However, it was much more complicated than what he had imagined. He might fall into someone's trap if he were not careful. However, Yishuan didn't think much about it at this time. And, this was probably related to that secret which could help people to enter the Great Sage Realm. Yishuan couldn't let this opportunity slip out of his hands. After all, his journey to the Great Sage Realm would become much simpler if he managed to obtain this secret. He knew nothing about this so-called secret. Therefore, it would be better for him to follow this team, and obtain some concrete information first. Moreover, those people who might scheme against him must know that he was no fool. Only the time would tell who schemed against whom. We must not delay in that case. We must rush over there, Yi Shiwen said. Then, both individuals quickly disappeared into the horizon. Both of them were outstanding experts in the sage realm. It was hard to tell how many miles they had traveled within the blink of an eye. They had arrived inside a mountain valley after about half-day's time. The Great Gas Collar was very famous for being a dangerous place. Violent auras of extremely fierce demon beasts could be felt everywhere. They would have had to fight with several beasts if Yi Shiwen hadn't sensed them in advance. Neither of them was afraid of those demon beasts. However, they wanted to avoid needless confrontations since they would have delayed them. The entire Great Gas Collar was full of dangers. It looked like a prehistoric great ancient continent from the fables. Wild auras of demon beasts were lurking everywhere. They were present in large numbers, and had formed a kingdom. This kingdom had an army. It seemed as if it was a country of demon beasts. The situation was very dreadful. They individually couldn't cause a threat to the elite human experts. However, they seemed terrifying when they appeared in groups. We will wait for them here. Our team had only a few people at first. But, those few people had gone to look for helpers afterwards. And, I happened to be the first one to return among them. Ding Tong said. This place is full of demon beasts. This place is more terrifying than a desolate wilderness. Moreover, I have means to escape from an expert of sage great perfection realm when it comes to one-on-one confrontation. However, it will be better to stay as far away as possible from that army of demon beasts. Yi Shiwen didn't say anything in response. An ordinary person must stay as far as possible from such an army of demon beasts. After all, one individual may be able to fight with 10 or even 100 beasts. However, an ordinary expert surely couldn't fight with 1,000 demon beasts. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't ordinary. He was capable of fighting with 1,000 demon beasts. So, he wasn't afraid of fighting with a huge group even if he was alone. After all, he had Phoenix regeneration technique to protect his body. So, he could recover from his injuries in an instant using this technique. Moreover, he had already perfected his tyrant body to the 7th layer. So, it wasn't that easy to injure him. Ding Tong had keenly noticed Yi Ziwen's silence to her remarks of caution. However, she maintained her composure. After all, it was normal for the powerful experts to be a bit arrogant. Moreover, this person had managed to escape from the hands of a great sage expert. She wouldn't have believed that this man who looked like an ordinary expert of the late stage of sage realm had escaped from the hands of a great sage expert if she hadn't seen it with her own eyes. In fact, she would have considered it a fairy tale if she had heard about this matter from someone. One would think that Yi Shiwen was unfathomable if they had seen him at that time. One couldn't tell what his background was. Yi Shiwen suddenly wrinkled his brows as he looked into the distance. A demon beast is peeping on us. Yi Shiwen coldly smiled and said. It's acting recklessly. Ding Tong was left dumbstruck as Yi Shiwen told her this. So, she swept out her divine sense. And, she found a spot in the space to be somewhat strange, and immediately became scared as a result. After all, they were about to gather at this place and a demon beast was spying here. This was a bad omen. It was possible that a force of demon beasts had been keeping watch here, and was planning to launch an ambush after they had come to know that these people were about to gather here. Moreover, it was also be possible that the demon beast which was spying on them was merely a pawn that had arrived here to confirm the news. In any case, it wasn't good news for them. Meanwhile, Yi Shiwen was about to attack. Bang! Suddenly, the entire sky began to tremble, and cracks opened up in the space. Startling divine beams surged down from the sky. Then, those enormous and powerful beams bombarded at that spot in the space. Ah! A scream sounded, and a demon beast fell down from the void. It had been blasted into two halves by the direct bombardment. Two figures came from afar treading on flying lights immediately after that. They had made a flashy entrance. They seemed to have traveled several hundred miles. Yi Shiwen condensed the real elemental energy in his eyes, and saw through the light that had filled the entire sky. He saw the figures of a man and a woman. The man stood in front. His imposing aura appeared like a mighty tide. He looked impressive, and his outstanding appearance seemed heroic. He possessed a kind of innate outstanding bearing. He seemed to be entirely different from a secretive kind of person like Yi Shiwen. They seemed to have two very different styles. A person could tell that this man was powerful by merely looking at him. On the other hand, one had to stay with Yi Shiwen for some time to recognize the extent of his strength. So, this man was entirely different from Yi Shiwen. The woman behind him was exactly the opposite. She wore a red dress that couldn't conceal her perfect figure. In addition, her perfect face carried an alluring and lovely appearance. One would feel a thrill deep in their bones if they shot a glance at her. "Gee, didn't I say that you're too careless, Ding Tong?" That demon beast had been observing our meeting spot. What would we have done if Brother Gu Tian hadn't attacked in time and that beast had spread the information? That alluring red-clothed woman scolded Ding Tong as soon as she arrived. Yi Shiwen shot a glance at Ding Tong, and found that her complexion had darkened. It was clear that she didn't have a good relation with this woman. "This is the helper I've found, Gu Tian. He is currently at Sage Great Perfection level, and is only one step away from entering Sage Accomplished Realm. He has arrived at Great Gas Collar in order to make the breakthrough. He will strive for a position among the top 10 individuals of Great Gas Building when the time comes." The charming red-clothed woman looked at that impressive man as she said, "Gee, this wouldn't be the helper that you found, right? Ding Tong, we're going to that tomb. There shall be dangers everywhere in that place. So, it would be a joke to take along an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm. He will only get tortured to death over there." The red-clothed woman shot a glance at Yi Shiwen, and made out his cultivation level. Then, she said somewhat disdainfully, "These people were at the Sage Great Perfection Realm. Only Yi Shiwen was at the late stage of Sage Realm. So, he stood out among these people in a way. However, he looked prominently weak, to be precise. The experts of late stage of Sage Realm weren't weak. In fact, they were famous even in the starry space. They could be sent to some remote star fields as ancestors without a problem. However, Yi Shiwen looked very weak in front of these three experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm. There's no problem if he himself gets killed. However, I'm afraid that he will drag us down with him. Do you think that this is a child's play that anyone can come and join?" The red-clothed woman disdainfully looked at Yi Shiwen. She looked deep into his eyes. She had hoped to see him all flustered and exasperated, and flying into a rage. However, she was surprised to see him calm and composed. It seemed that he either didn't mind her words, or had ignored them completely. "Yi Shiwen, this is my comrade, Xiao Yuan." Ding Tong's complexion soon restored to normal. However, she was unceasingly sneering in her mind. "You will surely come to know who's being funny when you experience how ferocious he is. This is the helper I've found, Yi Shiwen." "This is the helper you found? It's laughable. He. It would have been better if you had returned empty-handed instead of finding someone like this." Xiao Yuan rudely laughed. However, she realized that she had embarrassed herself because both the people whom she had ridiculed hadn't paid any attention to her. In fact, the way they had ignored her had left her to look like a clown. Consequently, a bitter look flashed in her eyes. Suddenly, another burst of divine rays flashed in the sky, and several figures came over flying. Chapter 550. A man stepped down from the flying light. He was dressed in yellow clothes. Ding Tong's voice rang in Yi Ziwen's ears. She had transmitted her voice to Yi Ziwen's brain using a secret sound transmission technique. "He is Yu Rui. He's the core disciple of the famous Seven Luminaries Divine School, which is located in the River Shore Star Field. Yi Xuan recalled that there was a school of this name in the River Shore Star Field. It was more powerful than the dominating Heaven Dojo. But it couldn't be compared with a giant force like the true Martial University. However, it was still a dominant party in the River Shore Star Field. This man's cultivation was as good as Gu Tian's. In fact, it seemed a bit more powerful than his. Yi Xuan could feel a suppressive force impacting his heart even though this man stood far away. The man carried an arrogant expression on his face. It seemed as if he was disdainfully overlooking the world. Another man arrived immediately after him. He was short in stature, and had prominent features. He looked unusually ugly. However, he was dressed in magnificent snow-white clothes. It seemed as if he was pretending to be an elegant young master, as if a monkey had worn a crown. He looked ridiculous. Moreover, Yi Xuan noticed that his legs looked weird. That man had concealed his legs well. However, Yi Xuan had noticed them at a glance. However, Yi Xuan didn't dare to underestimate him since his vigor and spirit were far more tyrannical than that of the yellow-clothed man. Moreover, his fundamental aura was randomly surging around. This man had already reached the peak of the Sage Great Perfection realm, and was only one step away from entering Sage Accomplished realm. Then, he would become a formidable person who would stand at the top of the Sage realm. He also had a blazing and ominous look in his eyes. This is Gong Yanjia. He's a major disciple of the Hidden Fantasy sect. It is a major sect in another star field. He's the strongest among the four of us. However, his temperament is very violent. And he hates it when people talk about his looks, or call him a cripple. You must also be careful about this. Ding Tong's voice reverberated in Yi Zaiwen's mind. Two men and a woman arrived immediately after them. One of those two men was dressed in a black robe, while the other wore a white robe. Both of them looked skinny, and had wretched facial features. Their appearance was very similar. It was obvious that they were twins. That woman was dressed in a black dress. She had a very cold bearing. It seemed as if she was emitting a chill from her body in order to keep everyone 1,000 miles away from her. She appeared to be indifferent towards everyone. Brother Gong Yan, how come you're so slow? My junior sister and I have been waiting for you for so long, the red-clothed woman Xiao Yuan delicately smiled and said. She herself had only recently arrived. However, it didn't appear so from her words. Would you not introduce these three people to us? Fu. Such a beautiful girl. He. We, the cultivators of yin and yang, had been looking for such a fine human cauldron for a long time, but we couldn't find any. The white-robed old man among those twins let out an evil laughter as he said. He looked at Xiao Yuan with an avaricious expression in his eyes. It seemed as if he wanted to swallow her whole. Tee. Indeed, elder brother, the black-robed old man also laughed sinisterly. What do you say, young girl? Marry my elder brother, and I can assure you that you will have the taste of being on the seventh heaven. Your cultivation will also advance by leaps and bounds. Sage Accomplished realm will only be a matter of time for you. These two old men had started to unscrupulously harass Xiao Yuan immediately after they had arrived. Yi Xuan had an incredible insight. So, he had seen through these two old men. They are probably walking on the path of dual cultivation. However, the evil energy soaring on their bodies makes it evident that they aren't walking on the correct path. Dual cultivation wasn't some depraved way. Instead, it was an upright and straightforward path of displaying one's strength and discipline. The legend of the Yellow Emperor who had become an immortal overnight by having sex with 100 females had been passed down for generations. The Taoist teaching also had a proper path of dual cultivation. And Buddhism had the so-called joyous way of meditation. So, it could clearly be seen that the path of dual cultivation wasn't some corrupt method. The monks paid particular attention to land, companion, principle, and wealth. Among these, the word companion referred to both mates and friends in one's life. So, it also contains the idea of dual cultivation within. However, every cultivator of dual cultivation path wasn't decent and righteous. There were many corrupt cultivators as well. Their dishonest ways would improve upon using this cultivation method. It also helped them in getting faster results. On the other hand, the honest and straightforward path of dual cultivation was all about long-term approach. Moreover, both the parties involved could benefit from it. On the contrary, the evil way of dual cultivation was often predatory in nature. One party would be withered to death after their primary essence had been entirely plundered by another party. These two men were clearly the dual cultivators of the evil way. In fact, one could tell that they weren't good people just by looking at them. Yi Shiwen carefully looked at Xiao Yuan once again. He found that she was an owner of the so-called inborn charming bone. This kind of constitution wasn't commonly seen in humans. This physique was very suitable for walking on the path of dual cultivation. One would make a rapid progress no matter whether they followed the correct way of cultivation or the evil way of cultivation. This method was outstanding. It was no wonder that these two old men were this interested in Xiao Yuan. After all, the rapid progress of their evil cultivation would no longer be a fantasy if they could use her as a human cauldron. However, Xiao Yuan wasn't aware of their ulterior motives. She only thought that they were old perverts. So, she looked at them in a very disgusted way. "Fuck off, you old motherfuckers." Xiao Yuan became furious. She took a valiant stance, and didn't show even a trace of weakness. "It will be better if the both of you behave yourself. Otherwise, I won't mind killing a few people in advance." Gu Tian stepped out and warned those two old men. He was the helper whom Xiao Yuan had brought along. He was a discerning person who could easily see their intentions for Xiao Yuan. And, he couldn't let those old men do whatever they wanted. "Kill us? Fufu. Pretty boy, you're very courageous." The white-robed old man stared maliciously at Gu Tian and said, "A bunch of ugly freaks." Gu Tian retorted disdainfully. His voice hadn't faded when a shrill sound of breaking of space was heard. A figure suddenly arrived in front of him, and threw a kick at him. Bang! The kick carried the impact of the end of the world. It formed a huge picture of the end of the world, and swept towards Gu Tian to shroud him. The air in the entire surrounding area froze. It was a scary sight. However, Gu Tian's reaction wasn't slow either. His cultivation of sage great perfection realm wasn't just for show. He shouted loudly, and his hands crisscrossed in order to resist the attack. Bang! The entire space sunk by that kick which had come straight from the end of the world. A sound of crunch was heard immediately afterwards. Gu Tian let out a stuffed groan, and got blown away. He then spouted a mouthful of blood. His hands softly hung down since they had been mangled by that kick. Everyone couldn't help but hold their breaths. They were stunned as they saw the scene before their eyes. All of them were proud and arrogant experts. However, they became scared as soon as they saw this scene. Gu Tian's strength wasn't lacking. He was a top expert of the sage great perfection realm. However, both of his hands had been broken by a single kick. The tyrannical strength of this kick had made them scared. At this time, that figure finally emerged. It turned out to be Gong Yanjia. His expression looked ice-cold as he looked at Gu Tian with his gloomy and cold eyes. Then, he tightly pursed up his lips and said, "Pretty boy, I will trample you to death if you make such irresponsible remarks next time." His voice sounded husky. Everyone was startled because of what had happened just now. It seemed as if a wild demon had crawled out of hell. Gu Tian's face flushed with embarrassment. He forcibly suppressed the injuries to his body, and stood up. His vision had turned gloomy and cold. He had never come across such a difficult situation. He had always been considered a Heaven's Pride expert. He had been treated as a treasure worth protecting. He had never been kicked by someone so pathetically. Crunch. Crunch. Gu Tian's broken hands suddenly recovered under his treatment. However, his complexion had turned ashen. He had realized that this man before his eyes wasn't an easy person to deal with. He looked lame. However, he was an exceptionally ominous person. Yi Shiwen had finally understood what Ding Tong had meant by violent temperament after Gu Tian had called Gong Yanjia an ugly freak. All individuals in this team were handsome men and beautiful women. Yi Shiwen wasn't exceptionally handsome. However, he was far from ugly. Only Gong Yanjia and those two old men behind him could be considered ugly. However, Gong Yanjia's reaction was far too violent. Apparently, he cared very much about his physical defect. In layman's language, the more a person cares about something, the less they have of it. The more a person cares about his appearance, the uglier they look. So, one must keep on experimenting with their looks. Also, a person tends to spend less of their money if they care too much about it. Yi Shiwen, each of these people are cruel and rebellious. Each of them is more arrogant and despotic than the other. They are a group of scoundrels. All of them have evil intentions. Are you sure you want to collaborate with these people? Yi Mo's voice reverberated in Yi Ziwen's mind. Yi Shiwen smiled and replied, I wouldn't mind working with a group of devils as long as they provided me enough assistance. Anyhow, these people are only a little cruel and untamed. That's all. Who doesn't want to look domineering nowadays? Xiao Yuan was also looking at Gong Yanjia with an ugly expression on her face. The graceful expression had vanished from her face. She was the one who had found Gu Tian. So, she had obviously lost her reputation. She might appear as a frivolous woman with no real depth in her character. However, she obviously had self-respect and pride since she was an expert of the sage great perfection realm. Fu. I told you this pretty boy is useless. However, you can still throw yourself into this old man's arms. I assure you that I will take you to the seventh heaven, the white-robed old man laughed and said. There was a sinister expression on his face. Xiao Yuan's complexion turned ugly. However, she ignored the two wretched old men. Next, I want to make a declaration. Gong Yanjia swept his ice-cold vision across everyone, and said in his usual husky voice, I shall be leading this group. All of you must listen and obey my commands. Who approves? Who opposes? Everyone was taken aback. They obviously hadn't expected this. The original members of the team like Yu Rui and Ding Tong were also shocked. Chapter 551. Who approves and who opposes? Everyone was taken aback. They hadn't thought that Gong Yanjia would declare his intention to lead them. Everyone was left dumbstruck. Is he insane? He is indeed very strong. However, other people in the team are also the experts of Sage Great Perfection realm. But, he wants to control everyone. Is he insane or what? You're insane, you cripple, nobody had said anything until now. Gu Tian was the first one to respond. He and Gong Yanjia had already become enemies. So, he didn't need to be afraid of anything now. Gong Yanjia stared at Gu Tian with his knife-like vision. His eyes conveyed a simple message. You don't approve? Then, get ready for a brutal fight. Our team contains people from various places. And, everyone's strength is nearly the same. There is a saying a bird without wings cannot fly, and a snake without head cannot crawl. Anyway, one of us must step up, and lead us in a certain direction. Otherwise, there will be a clash of opinions if there's no leader. Yu Rui opened his mouth this time, and said. He hadn't anticipated that Gong Yanjia would say such a thing at this time. However, he and Gong Yanjia had a certain amount of mutual understanding between them. Therefore, he was in favor of Gong Yanjia's proposal. But, the complexions of Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan didn't look good. They were already in the weak position among the four original members. Now, Gong Yanjia and Yu Rui had joined hands. So, it wasn't surprising that Yu Rui and Gong Yanjia had gone out together and returned together as well. Unfortunately, the two girls had very bad relations with each other. So, it was impossible for them to join hands to veto out the decision of the two male members of the team. Brother Yi, do you now understand why I had told you that we must stick together? Yi Shiwen heard Ding Tong's voice at this time. Yi Shiwen nodded. They might get swallowed if they didn't stick close together under this situation. Nobody has opposed. So, ill-regarded as everyone's approval. Gong Yanjia swept his dark and cold gaze across everyone. Everyone felt as if a wild beast was staring at them. Yi Shiwen could be called a humanoid monster because of his off-the-charts fighting strength. However, Gong Yanjia had made everyone feel that he was a beast draped in a man's skin. His sinister and ice-cold look had given everyone the chills. Then, everyone came to know from Yu Rui's introduction that these two old men whom Gong Yanjia had brought were known as Yin and Yang brothers. It was said that they were very infamous in a certain star field. It wasn't known how many women they had harmed. They used to plunder women's primary essences for their cultivation. So, it could be said that they were two very cruel people. They used to look for female experts for their cultivation. Many young female experts in that star field had fallen into the evil schemes of these two old bastards. The primary essences of men were useless to them. Therefore, they used to plunder only female experts. It wasn't known how many people had raised their voices against them, and had gotten killed for it. They had once alarmed a senior great sage expert. However, they had gotten informed about him in advance, and had escaped. The name of other black-clothed ice-cold woman was Mo Zhen. She was a core disciple of a women-only sect. She was outstanding. Fufu, boy, you are only at the late stage of sage realm. But, you've still dared to join this group. You're very courageous. However, you'll become a burden on us when the time comes. The black-robed old Yin among the Yin and Yang brothers laughed sinisterly at Yi Shiwen after their introductions had been made. Everyone was at the same level, apart from Yi Shiwen whom Ding Tong had brought. Therefore, everyone was suspecting whether Yi Shiwen had the capability to be one of them. An expert of the late stage of sage realm couldn't be considered as weak. But, the said expert couldn't be compared with these experts of sage great perfection realm. Therefore, saying that he would drag them down wasn't wrong. In fact, it was very logical. I will test him right away, okay? I will kill him right now if he has insufficient strength, the white-robed old Yang spoke loudly, and looked into Yi Zaiwen's eyes. His gaze became increasingly ice-cold and ruthless. The white-robed old Yang's voice hadn't even faded when a majestic aura suddenly locked on Yi Shiwen. Then, a big hand suddenly swept down towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. It transformed into a sky full of clouds, and slammed down. This was his famous master technique, the Yin and Yang big hand seal. A killer hand came down, and it seemed that it wouldn't give Yi Shiwen any way out. He and Yi Shiwen had no enmity. Still, he had resorted to such an extreme method against him. It was clear that his weird temperament wasn't just for show. Suddenly, a white Yin and Yang fish opened its big mouth, and swam towards Yi Shiwen to bite him. Then, the white Yin and Yang fish transformed into a fierce beast. Spirit energies gathered from all directions, and integrated into its body. The white-robed old Yang had the experience of several hundred years. So, he had practiced this Yin and Yang big hand seal to an unfathomable extent. It seemed that it would break the entire world as it smashed down. You're overreaching yourself. Yi Shiwen sneered. His entire golden vitality surged out, and began to boil. It soared into the sky, and a fist punched upwards. The fist transformed into a big star, and dashed up. The Yin and Yang fish had transformed into the Yin-Yang symbol. It seemed like the most intense collision in the universe when the Yin-Yang symbol issued an incomparably dreadful explosion. The entire space and the Yin-Yang symbol had gotten annihilated in that explosion. However, the momentum of Yi Zaiwen's fist hadn't decreased after it had pounded upon that white Yin and Yang fish. Bang! The explosion rose high up in the sky, transformed into endless spirit energies, and scattered in the atmosphere. Yishuan trod forward at an extraordinary pace. His fist had arrived in front of the white-robed old yang. "This is bad," the white-robed old yang secretly muttered. However, there was no time to regret. So, he quickly retreated in frenzy. Rumble. Yi Zaiwen's fist smashed down on the valley, and the entire valley disintegrated. The rest of the people promptly retreated far away from the range of impact. They had a conflicted look on their faces as they looked at Yishuan. Nobody had thought that Yishuan could be so ferocious. Ding Tong was the one who had found him. However, even she hadn't thought that he could be so incredible. After all, she had only seen him escaping from the hands of a great sage expert and nothing more. She had roped him in because she was looking for a person with excellent agility skill. She had thought that it would be rather convenient if someone were to aid her in quick exploration when the time was right. However, she had suddenly seen that Yishuan didn't merely possess an excellent agility skill. In fact, his strength was also very impressive. Everyone had a newfound respect for him. An ordinary person could never possess such awesome strength. And, they certainly couldn't issue such a powerful move. She had never thought that Yishuan could have such strength. The white-robed old yang had retreated. However, Yishuan wasn't going to let him off. That old man had attacked with all of his strength. He hadn't held back even a bit. So, how could Yishuan spare him? Yin and yang body protection, endless chaos, eternal existence. White-robed old yang's yin and yang fish suddenly transformed into a yin and yang symbol, and wrapped him up. The black-robed old yin proudly looked at everyone and said, "This is the super technique of us brothers who follow the path of yin and yang. It is known as primal chaos of yin and yang. All living things will transform into the energy of yin and yang along with any form of energy that breaks into the field. And then, it will be absorbed. So, it's impossible to budge us." Everyone felt dreaded when they heard this. They pondered on this matter. How would we break out if we encountered this kind of yin and yang field? Everyone frowned since they didn't have any means to escape the field. In fact, it was very difficult to deal with the worldly forces related to chaos, such as yin and yang, the 5 elements, and so on. The reason for this was that such forces often flowed in the form of an unending stream. "What's so great about this yin and yang of yours? Watch how I destroy it." Yishuan was unfazed. His offensive didn't halt even a bit. There was nothing fancy about his attack. In fact, he hadn't used any special move. He had simply unleashed a dreadful attack with sheer brute power. This was the crudest attack. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's big star collided with that yin and yang-based attack, and it almost began to transform into yin and yang energy. In fact, it seemed as if it was evolving toward a more advanced grade of power. Bang! But then, that yin and yang-based attack began to explode in the face of Yi Zaiwen's fierce offensive, and set off a dreadful storm. How is this possible? Nobody can tackle my yin and yang technique. How did you do it? The white-robed old yang had a look of disbelief in his eyes as he gazed at Yishuan. He couldn't believe that Yishuan possessed such ability. His yin and yang power had emerged out of the dual cultivation. Many people looked down on it. However, it was a very clever kind of martial arts. Yin and yang together contained the principles of all living things. He could possibly become a great sage expert if he continued to practice the yin-yang method. He had fought with many people who were at the same realm as him. However, nobody had been successful at cracking it, let alone cracking it so easily. What yin and yang technique? Is your yin and yang evenly balanced? Yishuan said disdainfully. It would have been an enormous trouble for him if he had been facing the yin and yang brothers together. However, the white-robed old yang had been relying only on the principle of transforming yang into yin. He had transformed a part of his yang power into yin polarity. However, the powers of yin and yang poles weren't in equilibrium. The power of yang pole was still more powerful. it was simply impossible to form the balance between yin and yang with this creation method. Basically, it only appeared powerful. The white-robed old yang hadn't met a unique and exceptionally powerful expert like Yi Shiwen before. Yi Zaiwen's offensive effortlessly broke the white-robed old yang's attack. So, he had started to think about retreating since he was on the verge of death. However, Yi Zaiwen's power locked him firmly on the spot. So, he couldn't go anywhere. Stop! The black-robed old yin finally reacted. After all, he couldn't let Yi Shiwen proceed with his attack. Suddenly, an extremely pure power of yin polarity swept out towards Yi Shiwen. It seemed that it would stop him. However, how could it be so easy to stop Yi Shiwen? Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist power hadn't lost its momentum. So, it finally smashed on the white-robed old yang's body. Bang! The white-robed old yang's body disintegrated before everyone's eyes. Brother, the black-robed old yin screamed loudly. Chapter 552. Brother, tears of blood came out of the eyes of the black-robed old yin as he screamed. These two brothers had been roaming unhindered for many years. They had been inseparable. So, he had never expected that he would have to helplessly watch his brother explode to death one day. And, this feeling had simply torn his heart apart. Yi Shiwen stretched out his left hand. It then turned into a claw. And, that claw conveniently grabbed the mighty power of the yin polarity that had been falling down, and crushed it. It didn't matter whether it was the power of extreme yin polarity or extreme yang polarity. Yi Shiwen would give it no importance if there wasn't a proper balance between the yin and yang forces. My God, how can he be so powerful? Xiao Yuan stared blankly at Yi Shiwen. Her eyes contained a terrified expression. She had never thought that Yi Shiwen could be so powerful. She and Ding Tong were sworn enemies. Therefore, she had made fun of Yi Shiwen whom Ding Tong had brought along. However, she hadn't thought that he could be so powerful. And, she was extremely shocked as a result. She hadn't been this surprised when that cripple Gong Yanjia had attacked. He had certainly gained the upper hand while confronting Gu Tian. However, both of them belonged to the same realm. And, it was normal to have a strong person and a weak person in the same realm. However, Yi Shiwen had killed that white-robed old yang even though Yi Shiwen was merely at the late stage of Sage Realm. In fact, he had dominated him thoroughly. And, that white-robed old yang didn't even have the power to fight back in the end. These yin and yang brothers had to unite in order to display their supreme might. However, it was impossible now. Yu Rui and the other people had also become afraid after they had found out how powerful Yi Shiwen was. It could be clearly seen that they had been blown away by Yi Zaiwen's incredible fighting strength. He had pushed them in a bigger shock as compared to Gong Yanjia. I'll kill you. The black-robed old yin stared at Yi Shiwen with bloodshot eyes. It seemed that he wanted to tear him into two halves. A predominantly black yin and yang fish boiled in his hand. It then rushed towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen sneered. He was about to deal with this black-robed old yin when a divine beam fell from the sky, and enveloped that black yin and yang fish. Everyone stared blankly. The man who had shot that beam turned out to be the cripple Gong Yanjia. His eyes looked dark and ice-cold as he said in his husky voice, "This matter ends here. The entire team must follow my commands from now on. Didn't I tell you not to violate my order?" Gong Yanjia looked into Yi Zaiwen's eyes. His gaze was brimming with anger. However, it contained a bit of jealousy as well. He hadn't attacked Yi Shiwen recklessly since he had also become somewhat afraid of him. He had been taken aback by Yi Zaiwen's recent performance. In fact, he was no longer sure that he would be able to defeat Yi Shiwen. Therefore, he hadn't attacked. He had connived with the white-robed old yang to launch a big attack on Yi Shiwen. He had planned to take him down using the old yang's brute strength. After all, he knew that everyone in this team had ulterior motives. So, he had planned to attack Yi Shiwen in order to overwhelm the others. However, he had clearly understood that he had made a blunder. There were many things that weren't as smooth as he imagined them to be. The white-robed old Yang had died at the hands of Yishuan. But, he couldn't let the black-robed old Yin die in a similar fashion. After all, he would lose his prestige if that happened. He has killed my brother. The eyes of the black-robed old Yin were wide open. He hadn't thought that he would lose his brother in this fight. His heart was full of hatred for Yishuan. However, he couldn't understand that the problem lay with him and his brother. After all, they wouldn't have kicked an iron wall like Yishuan if they hadn't been so arrogant and despotic. In fact, this represented the saying you reap what you sow. Awesome. Gee. I couldn't have imagined that a character like you would be hidden among us. You're an elusive talent. The universe is so big, and it's full of wonderful things. Yurui stepped forward to resolve the dispute. A man like Brother Yi is involved in our operation this time. So, our operation will certainly go smoothly. No harm will come our way. Yurui continued. The black-robed old Yin didn't behave arrogantly towards Yishuan this time. This represented the so-called saying one shows their arrogance towards those who aren't as powerful as them. After all, one must maintain their so-called dignity. The black-robed old Yin couldn't be arrogant while dealing with an expert like Yishuan. Otherwise, it would be too bad for him if Yishuan misunderstood him and got provoked. Moreover, he had also witnessed Yi Zaiwen's ruthless side by now. So, he didn't wish to confront Yishuan directly. The black-robed old Yin swept his gaze across everyone. Ding Tong would definitely stand on Yi Zaiwen's side. Xiao Yuan had also become furious with him and his brother a moment ago. Gu Tian had been blown away by his boss Gong Yanjia. So, he wouldn't help him either. Gong Yanjia could be considered to be on his side, but he didn't seem to be interested in collaborating against Yishuan. He could guess what these people were thinking at the moment. Each of them was selfish, and had personal ambitions. So, why would they agree to take the risk of testing out Yi Zaiwen's true strength in order to avenge his brother? Moreover, who would cry for them if they got slaughtered by Yishuan? He knew that he was no match for Yishuan without their help. His strength was almost the same as that of his brothers. And, Yishuan had made his brother retreat again and again. His brother had been comprehensively defeated. In fact, his brother had been killed in only one move. The black-robed old Yin wasn't much better than his brother. The two brothers could have contended against Yishuan if they had joined hands against him. But, how could they possibly join hands now? Therefore, he could only clench his teeth and glare at Yishuan. He had to forcibly make himself give up the idea of attacking Yishuan. However, he had developed a deep hatred for Yishuan in his heart. He would certainly not think twice before attacking Yishuan if he got the right opportunity. He hated all these people as well. After all, his brother would still be alive if they had tried to save him instead of sitting back and watching him die. Yishuan coldly looked at everyone. He had understood that each person in this team had ulterior motives. In fact, it was difficult to understand how such a team had been formed in the first place. He could trust Ding Tong, and only slightly at that. However, he believed that the other people would turn against him as soon as they got the opportunity. In fact, they wouldn't even think twice about it. All of us want to go to the tomb because there might be some secret regarding advancing to the great sage realm at that place. However, there's no need to harm friends. Yurui pretended to be a good man, and said. It would be difficult to figure what kind of person was behind his goody two-shoes persona if one hadn't seen the arrogance on his face earlier. We shouldn't delay in that case. It would be better if we got there quickly. Yishuan said. What are you so desperate about? The tomb wouldn't have opened yet. Gong Yanjia's hoarse voice revealed a contemptuous tone. It was clear that he was making fun of Yi Zaiwen's lack of knowledge. However, Yishuan didn't get angry. After all, he indeed didn't know anything about this matter. So, it would be better if he followed other people for now. There must be layer upon layer of matrix formations outside the tomb. A large number of experts must have arrived there already. They may have brought the masters of matrix formations along with them. We don't need to attack the matrix formations. We must wait until those experts and masters have broken them down. We will take advantage of the confusion once those matrix formations are down, and we will enter without making any delay. Gong Yanjia said, a large number of experts must have arrived this time, and many of them should be at the sage accomplished level. They could get mixed among the ordinary experts, and launch a surprise attack. Therefore, we must stay united. You must obey my orders. Otherwise, we will be defeated when the time comes. So, don't blame me for being strict. Gong Yanjia was looking at Yishuan as he said. Clearly, what he had said was directed at Yishuan. After all, Yishuan was the only one among these people whose ambitions he couldn't see through. Moreover, he had become a bit scared after he had witnessed Yizaiwen's power. He was confident that he could deal with most of these people. But, there was one person who might not obey him. And, that individual was this extremely powerful, untamed, domineering, and violent man Yishuan. Yishuan showed neither approval nor disapproval. He remained quiet. After all, he would look for an opportunity to get away from this group when the time would come. And, stay united. It was all bullshit. Anyone could tell that these people could never unite. Gong Yanjia had urged them to stay united in order to stop them from turning against each other. And, this was probably a good strategy for now. Yishuan wouldn't think of destroying this unity under normal conditions. However, Gong Yanjia had better not blame Yishuan for being strict if the former tried to treat him as cannon fodder. Roar! 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 Gong Yanjia hadn't finished criticizing Yishuan when the roars of demon beasts reverberated in the surroundings. Black clouds filled the entire sky, and waves of evil wind appeared like wailing ghosts and howling wolves. Countless tyrannical figures of hill-sized demon beasts appeared in front of everyone. Everyone's complexion suddenly changed. They were surrounded by an army of demon beasts. One must know that the most dangerous entities in the Great Gas Collar were these demon beasts. Nobody had been able to wipe out these demon beasts in all these years. The formidable ones among them had even formed a country of demon beasts. There wasn't any difference between them and the humans, apart from their appearance. The most ferocious ones among them were the so-called commander beasts and soldier beasts. An ordinary person would have a hard time escaping if they came across them. These demon beasts were very cunning. In fact, the old demon beasts that had been living for thousands of years were as intelligent as humans, if not more. They had gathered as an army in order to chase and kill these human experts who had entered the Great Gas Collar. These demon beasts were much more organized as compared to the unorganized experts in Yizaiwen's team and all the other experts who had arrived from the River Shore Star Field and many other star fields. And, this organized army of demon beasts was a deadly threat. An ordinary person would have to struggle in order to escape if they came across these demon beasts. Damn it! How have these demon beasts found us? Yu Rui couldn't maintain his elegant demeanor this time, and secretly cursed. Yishuan, Gu Tian, Xiao Yuan, and Ding Tong immediately recalled that demon beast who had been spying on them. They had killed it. However, they didn't know that it had managed to send the information which had attracted such a big army of demon beasts. Chapter 553. Countless tyrannical demon beasts had been lurking in the Great Gas Collar. And, it would be the most dreadful thing when they'd assembled and form an army. Yishuan looked at the battle formation of the demon beasts. The majority of these demon beasts were at the semi-sage realm. Some more powerful and adult ones were at the sage realm. Such an army was terrifying from a general perspective. Hardly anyone could deal with this army. Humans, you must surrender obediently and become my slaves. I may spare your life if you do so, a buzzing voice came from the army of the demon beasts. It sounded somewhat hoarse and shaky. It seemingly sounded a bit shaky because they weren't used to talking in the human tongue. This army is being led by a demon commander. Yu Rui frowned and said. However, he looked somewhat relaxed. After all, it was much better to have a demon commander leading the army than a demon king. It didn't matter how powerful a demon commander was. It could at most be at the sage great perfection level. However, a demon king in the Great Gas Collar could even be at the sage accomplished realm. They might get an opportunity to escape if they were to come across such a large army of demon beasts or a sage accomplished level demon king. However, they wouldn't stand a chance if they had to face both of them together. However, Yi Shiwen could escape from the hands of a great sage expert. So, he wasn't much concerned. In fact, everyone had become relaxed after they had realized that it was only a demon commander who was leading this army. The demons have arrived. Everyone must get ready to execute them. Gong Yanjia sneered. What kind of arrogance did he possess? He wanted to command these experts in order to attain the supreme throne in the team. So, how could he surrender to these demon beasts? It was impossible. His voice hadn't faded when his leg suddenly stepped out. It transformed into boundless wind and clouds, and stamped down. Bang! A large number of demon beasts got crushed to death. The space got trampled down by his leg. Gong Yanjia's tyrannical power was simply incredible. His cripple-looking leg was his weak point. But, it was also his biggest weapon. He had transformed his defective leg into a sage tool. So, it possessed endless might, and was extremely terrifying. It was no wonder that Gu Tian hadn't been able to stop his kick, and had been sent flying. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons for it was that there was a difference in their strengths. However, the main reason was the infinite might that his leg had obtained after being transformed into a sage tool. The troubles keep coming one after another. Yi Shiwen frowned. It could be said that there were endless troubles in the Great Gas Collar. However, he didn't have any other option at this time. He had to go all out, and slaughter these demon beasts. In fact, it wasn't only Gong Yanjia. Even the others weren't ready to withdraw. They all attacked one after another. They were outstanding people. They wouldn't surrender to anyone, let alone to these demon beasts. These sage great perfection level experts had attacked with their entire strength. How could those semi-sage level demon beasts stop their attacks? Even the sage level demon beasts in that group screamed as they got crushed to death one after another. Damn it, humans, you don't listen until you've been forced. Kill them for me, my children. Their flesh and blood will be a treat for us. The demon commanders flustered, and an exasperated command came from the middle of the army of the demon beasts. It believed that it was giving these humans a chance to live. Therefore, it hadn't expected that these humans would dare injure his children by disregarding his mercy. Suddenly, the densely packed army of demon beasts rushed towards the human team in an overwhelming manner. And, a myriad of demonic martial arts were unleashed towards the human experts to kill them. These demon beasts couldn't match with these outstanding experts individually. However, they were marching in formation at this time. So, they were able to firmly resist the attacks of these outstanding experts. Yu Rui and the other people could only unceasingly evade while facing this joint attack that consisted of various demonic martial arts. They didn't dare to get close. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have time to care about other people. Countless densely packed demon beasts were rushing towards him. A storm of demon beasts was rushing towards him along with waves of demon wind. Countless martial arts transformed into demonic beams, and swept out towards him. Yi Shiwen didn't dare to delay. He promptly started to operate the observing person scripture inside his body. Then, two hammer-like fists transformed into two big stars, and smashed down. Bang! 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 Pitiful screams were heard every time Yi Zaiwen's hammer-like fists pounded. They were accompanied by explosions of flesh and blood. Yi Mo was busy enjoying himself inside Yi Zaiwen's body. After all, the blood essences and inner cores of these demon beasts were being absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. Consequently, the mirror was becoming more and more powerful with each passing second. Its aura was also becoming more and more pure and smooth. Apparently, it was advancing towards an amazing transformation. It had to move ahead one step in order to transform into a great sage tool from a sage tool. It would be able to crush these demon beasts effortlessly once it had completed the transformation. The difference between a sage tool and great sage tool was same as the difference between a sage expert and great sage expert. It was like the difference between cloud and mud, or heaven and earth. A great sage tool's full strength attack was almost equal to a great sage expert's full strength attack. It wouldn't matter how tyrannical the army of these sage-level demon beasts was if they were attacked with a great sage tool, they would be obliterated without exception. However, a huge amount of energy was required in order to complete the transformation. And, it would take a lot of time to gather that much energy. Yi Shiwen was fighting with his entire strength since those demon beasts were way too many. He wasn't worried about defending himself or exhausting his entire real elemental energy. However, other people were. Ding Tong was fighting with a sage-level demon beast. It was a terrifying expert of the sage great perfection realm. She was unceasingly swallowing spirit dawn for replenishing her real elemental energy. However, she still wasn't able to keep up with the energy consumption required for facing the full strength attacks of this sage great perfection level expert. The attack of a sage great perfection level expert would certainly be overwhelming. Therefore, the consumption of real elemental energy and spirit energies would be of an astronomical amount. How could she meet this requirement by depending upon her own natural rate of restoration? It was impossible unless she possessed a secret magical technique like the Phoenix regeneration technique that went against the heaven's will. Ding Tong was attacking with her entire strength, and was swallowing all sorts of spirit dawn for replenishing her real elemental energy. However, she was still finding it difficult to hold her own. It was difficult to say who was stronger and who was weaker between a human expert and a demon beast since both of them had strong and weak points. The key was to see who could display their strengths to the peak at a crucial time. Only the one who could display their strength to the peak could defeat their enemy. Ding Tong had ample fighting experience. However, her opponent was more cunning than her. And, it was taking proper advantage of its tyrannical body. In fact, she would have lost 100 times by now if Yi Shiwen hadn't been helping her from time to time. Yi Shiwen, the blood essences of these semi-sage and sage-level demon beasts aren't enough. You must supply the Heavenly Source Mirror with lots of good quality blood essences if you want the Heavenly Source Mirror to become a great sage tool. In fact, it should level up very quickly if you kill a few great sage-level beasts, and let it absorb their whole blood essences. Yi Mo's voice reverberated in Yi Ziwen's mind. He had absorbed a lot of blood essence and inner cores by now. However, those couldn't be put to use immediately. After all, he had to refine them first. Therefore, one must not look at it as the quantity is very huge because high quantity is directly related to low quality. Therefore, the final result wouldn't be that good. It would be far better to kill a powerful demon beast to get the desired result. Other people would have certainly gotten scared to death if they had heard Yi Mo's idea. Gong Yan Jia had killed many demon beasts under his foot. In fact, he had even crushed a demon commander of sage great perfection level. However, even he wouldn't dare to go deeper into the formation of these beasts. One would be torn to pieces by the countless formidable demon beasts if they went deeper into their formation. However, this was nothing for Yi Shiwen. It was very difficult for those demon beasts to injure him. Moreover, he could unsteel himself with the help of Phoenix regeneration technique even if he sustained injuries. Therefore, this wasn't a problem for him. Yi Shiwen silently thought for a moment. What? You're asking me to kill a few great sage demon beasts? Great sage demon beasts don't grow on trees. It is very difficult to find them. Moreover, I can only escape a great sage demon beast. Am not powerful enough to kill one. So, chasing after a great sage demon beast is definitely not a thing to consider. Promotion of Heavenly Source Mirror to great sage level still looked far-fetched. He had already decided that he would make Heavenly Source Mirror his primary divine tool. Therefore, it was worth it to invest everything into the Heavenly Source Mirror. After all, he would obtain great benefits in the future in the form of repayment. However, Yishuan still decided to try to burst into the formation of demon beasts. There are too many demon beasts. They seem to be infinite in number. But, this problem can't be solved by simply wasting time. In fact, the demon beasts would continue to arrive if we delay. Moreover, it won't be easy to wipe them out if they went back to the kingdom of demon beasts. The best way would be to kill the commanding general of these demon beasts. Then, this army of demon beasts would scatter. These demon beasts can be considered as intelligent as the human beings. However, they aren't humans. All of them are cruel and rebellious. They have gathered only because of the deterrence of their great general. So, I reckon that they will disperse if that senior demon general of theirs is killed. Yishuan didn't hesitate any further after he had thought this. He transformed into a golden streamer, and burst into the group of demon beasts. Everyone watched him blankly as he burst into the group of demon beasts. Does he have a death wish? There's no need to be so rash. Yurui muttered to himself as his bayonet pierced an approaching demon beast. The other experts couldn't believe that someone had dared to burst into the demon beasts. One could probably sweep away a tribe of ordinary demon beasts. However, such an organized army of demon beasts was extremely terrifying. Damn it! This boy better not die, the black-robed old Een said as if he was showing pity. However, he wasn't feeling pity for Yishuan. He had said these words only because he wanted to kill him personally. What's he up to? An expression of shock flashed in Ding Tong's eyes. She didn't know what Yishuan was planning to do. Gong Yan Jia had been indulged in a crazy slaughter. However, even he was in a state of disbelief at the moment. But, he didn't believe that Yishuan was some crazy guy. He's a guy who kills very decisively. How can such a guy be insane? So, the only possibility is that he has some assurance. What's he leaning on? Why is he so powerful? You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.